Joseph Alexander Lane, Best Brother, Best Friend. Written by David Lane. Narrated by Jason Zenobia. The man I'm writing about is not famous. It may be that he never will be. It may be that when his life at last comes to an end, he will leave no more trace of his sojourn on earth than a stone thrown into a river leaves on the surface of the water. But it may be that the way of life that he has chosen for himself and the peculiar strength and sweetness of his character may have an ever-growing influence over his fellow men, so that, long after his death perhaps, it may be realized that there lived in this age a very remarkable creature. Somerset Maugham, The Razor's Edge. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The greatness of a man is not in how much wealth he acquires, but in his integrity and his ability to affect those around him positively. Bob Marley. The supreme quality for leadership is unquestionably integrity. Without it, no real success is possible, no matter whether it is on a section gang, a football field, in an army, or in an office. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Integrity without knowledge is weak and useless, and knowledge without integrity is dangerous and dreadful. Samuel Johnson. From the time we are born, our brothers and sisters are our collaborators and co-conspirators, our role models and our cautionary tales. Jeffrey Kluger, The Sibling Effect. Once a brother, always a brother, no matter the distance, no matter the difference, and no matter the issue. Byron Pulsifer. What does it mean to be a brother? Is it a person related by blood that happens to be a male sibling? Or is it more a kinship born out of commonality and honed by the continuing sparks of life's events? Understandably, a brother is more than a person born. It is a person grown together through the hills and valleys, united in success and joined in defeat. Theodore W. Higginsworth. Dedication. To my sister Kim, who has been the guardian angel of our family and who was Joseph's favorite dinner companion. Vitals. Born February 15, 1952. Parents, Warren Joseph and Louise Shuey. Siblings, Kimball Ann, Michael Shuey, David Christopher. Height, 5'11". Weight, 165. Married, Kathy O'Kane. Children, Peter and Allison. Education, B.A., California State University Northridge, Notre Dame High School, St. Charles Elementary. Residence, Seal Beach, California. Occupation, Clerk, Executive Officer of the Court of Appeal, 2nd Appellate District, 39 years of exemplary service. Activities: surfing, golfing, body surfing, hiking, camping, frisbee golf, extreme croquet. Favorite food: Mexican, Henry's, smokehouse, homemade chili. Favorite drinks: Coca-Cola with occasional lapses with RC, tea and coffee. Dislikes: corrupt politicians, badly written history, movies with plot holes, and unfairness. Likes: audiobooks, books, great movies, and television. Introduction. My older brother Joseph, I invariably called him Joe, was 4 years older than me. He was my best friend. He was also my coach, my mentor, my surf companion, my golf partner, instructor, frisbee golf colleague, ping-pong nemesis, croquet competitor, electric bicycle sidekick, audiobook comrade, co-conspirator in a series of juvenile hijinks, my personal confidant, my political ally, my fellow movie and book critic, and much more. Each of us has many sides, some of which we dare not reveal lest others find out that we may have contradictory natures. But humans are a complex species, and what part we display to others depends on our specific relationship, be it to our parents, our brothers and sisters, our friends, our spouses, our children, and our co-workers. Nobody can capture the entirety of one's entire personality, nor should it be surprising that we may act differently at various times and at varying places. I say this because I have witnessed many facets of my brother Joseph throughout our 65 years together here on planet Earth. We have laughed, cried, and even fought, but throughout it all we were always extremely close and always there for each other no matter what odd or tragic circumstance may have arisen. Although this small book contains a series of stories about my brother from my perspective, I know that my sister, his wife, his children, and his friends have their own distinct memories worthy of retelling and cherishing. My hope is that they too will be able to share with me and others what Joseph meant to them. I would like to point out one particular virtue about my brother Joseph here that I think deserves special emphasis since it goes to the very heart of his character. He was a giver, never a taker, even to the very end of his life when he was suffering from heart disease, melanoma, and leukemia. My brother Joseph always helped me and anyone who needed his assistance. He went beyond himself time and time again. There was never a time that we couldn't count on him. Joe was always there to give a helping hand. He was our rock and the one person I looked up to more than anyone else. A teacher I once knew in India said many times that if you genuinely love someone, you will have an inordinate amount of respect for him or her, so much so that you will also have a fear of offending that person lest they be displeased. As much as I loved my brother Joseph, I also had such a high regard for him that I feared annoying him. Because I knew Joe so well, I intuited precisely when to keep quiet, lest he lose patience with his annoying younger brother who always pestered him with questions or for advice. But even then, when I crossed a line or two, Joseph never pushed me away and always apologized if he sensed that my feelings were hurt. I feel blessed to have the best brother in the world. I don't say that lightly or to indulge in unnecessary hyperbole. Anyone who knows Joseph knows that I was the luckiest kid in the world to have such a kind and good-hearted brother. My wish is that his example of forever giving serves as a beacon for me and others to follow his luminous example. 1. How to hike a football. One of my fondest memories of my brother Joseph, and one which shows his skill as my personal coach, concerns how to hike a football when the quarterback is in a shotgun position. Here's the scenario. I am in 5th grade and trying out as a center for our flag football team at St. Charles Elementary School in North Hollywood, California. Our quarterback is Pat Donahue, who is in 6th grade and an accomplished athlete. My problem was that I was having trouble making certain that the football spirals correctly when I hiked it. My hikes were a wobbly mess and difficult to catch quickly and then make a pass or allow a punter to kick the ball swiftly without being blocked. I have small hands. Okay, bigger than a president, I won't mention, and this made it doubly problematic for me to get the right handle on the football. I suspected that if I didn't learn how to hike correctly, I was going to be relegated to the bench, which was the last thing I wanted to happen. I go and tell my brother Joseph about my dilemma. He immediately takes me in the backyard and every day for 2 weeks systematically and patiently guides me, given my dexterous limitations, on how to make a perfect spiral almost every time. I eventually mastered the art of hiking a long ball and became the season's starter as center, to the obvious relief of Pat, whose job I made easier by not spewing out shaky hikes. What was most remarkable about this simple gesture was that Joe was busy in high school at the time, and instead of ignoring me, he took time out each day to help his struggling younger brother. His genius, of course, was knowing how to get an awkward kid to actually learn a new skill and not giving up until he did. I would later incorporate this type of instruction later in life when I taught my Japanese students at the University of California, San Diego, on how to surf at Del Mar during the summer. The key lesson here for a teacher to a student is never give up until the goal is accomplished. My brother Joseph never gave up on me, even if it meant spending hours teaching me how to hike a football. 2. Christmas gifts. When I was a young teenager, my central focus was playing sports. I loved playing basketball and was on several teams, from the now politically incorrect Midget League at North Hollywood Park to elementary and high school teams. I was an avid fan of UCLA and the Lakers. During those days, it was not uncommon to use one basketball for years until it became as smooth as Telly Savalas's bald scalp. Sorry for the dated 1970s Kojak television reference. The reason, of course, is that most of us kids didn't have disposable cash. You played with what you had. Aristotelis Savalas, January 21, 1922 to January 22, 1994, known professionally as Telly Savalas, was an American actor and singer whose career spanned 4 decades. Noted for his bald head and deep, resonant voice, he is perhaps best known for portraying Lieutenant Theo Kojak on the crime-drama series Kojak, 1973 to 1978, and James Bond arch-villain Ernst Stavro Blofeld in the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, 1969, excerpted from Wikipedia entry on the famous Kojak actor. However, with Christmas coming up, circa 1969, I desperately wanted a leather basketball just like the ones they used in official NBA games. It was, for me, prohibitively expensive. Although I mentioned this gift idea to my parents, they didn't buy it, figuratively or literally. But on that Christmas morning, as I was unwrapping gifts, my brother Joseph brought me a round-looking object as his gift to me. As I opened it up, my eyes widened and then, given my overly emotional nature, teared up. It was precisely the NBA leather ball I wanted. I couldn't believe it. How could Joe afford such a present? Even my parents were surprised by his generosity. Yet Joe knew his younger brother well, and his greatest joy at Christmas was knowing how stoked I would be by such a thoughtful gesture. It was, and still is, one of my all-time favorite gifts. Joseph was also instrumental in convincing my parents, particularly my mother Louise, in buying me the right gifts for my birthday, ranging from a specially made and now exceedingly rare belly board called the Wedge Special to full-body wetsuits so I could surf in the winter and not turn blue from hypothermia at morning sessions at Zuma Beach. Joe was always keenly aware of what I wanted, and he always made sure that my dreams were fulfilled. Joe was my real Santa Claus. 2 years after this, when the American Basketball Association had come into its own, think Dr. Julius Erving, they differentiated themselves from the NBA in 2 distinct ways: 3-point baskets from outside the perimeter and a red, white, and blue-colored basketball. Naturally, I wanted one of those unique balls for myself. Guess who unexpectedly bought it for me that very Christmas? My brother. Keep in mind that it was even more expensive than the one he had bought me previously. My dad, Warren, knew he couldn't compete in the gift department with his middle son. 3. The Critic. I think this may be a good time for me to introduce another angle to my brother Joseph, lest we sink into a Pollyanna-ish description, making him sound like Mother Teresa's lost nephew. Alwa Gumbar is reportedly the one surviving nephew of Mother Teresa. He is a well-regarded goldsmith in Skopje, the city where his famous aunt was born. Joe could be a very harsh critic, whether it was about a poorly made movie, an inaccurate history of World War II, or a wave that could have been ridden better. I mention the latter since there was a moment at Malibu Colony back in the early 1970s which perfectly captures my brother's captious ways. It was summertime, and the south swell had just hit, with waves about 4 to 5 foot with excellent shape. All of us had been riding waves for a couple of hours when Joe decided to take a break and sit on the beach and watch us. In those days, we were all riding these styrofoam speedy boards that you could buy for a couple of bucks from the local thrifty drugstore. Try as I might, I cannot track down the history behind these unusual boards. Whoever designed them was well acquainted with the physics of hydrodynamics. Its futuristic design would be a welcome addition today in contradistinction to the uninspired Maury boogie clones that are ubiquitous at Costco and elsewhere. This was before Tom Maury had invented the boogie board, and the speedy board was far ahead of its time, with a rounded nose, a very pronounced rocker, and twin elevated tails. As Joe was sitting on the beach, a perfect left peak came to me, and I proceeded to ride it for 100 yards, screaming the whole way as it was one of the best waves I had ever ridden up to that time. However, as I navigated the inside section, it sucked out, and I ended up doing an elevator drop which caused my fragile styrofoam board to break in half. I came on shore, picked up the 2 pieces, and ran to my brother Joseph to see if he would give me the full nod for such a long ride. Instead, he looked at my broken board and with an ironic smile said, "Dave, if you rode that wave correctly, the board wouldn't have broken." I was crestfallen. This was so typical of him, I thought. Later, however, it became a running joke between us, since I knew that getting a compliment out of him was extremely rare. But because of that rarity, it made me try harder at whatever I did. As a side note, I'm reminded of the time that our friend, Joe DiCiro, broke his speedy board in half at the Huntington Beach cliffs on his very first wave. It was particularly painful for him since the waves were pumping. Being my typical assuaging self, I tried to tell J.D. that he could ride the front half of the board, even though it was but 2 feet in length. He looked at me with a death stare and said, "Yeah, you try riding this thing." We then started laughing uncontrollably, knowing all too well it was nearly impossible. 50 years later, we still talk about that day and laugh. A small tragedy turned into a great and funny story over time. In India, on one of my many research trips, I met a very wise spiritual teacher who repeatedly said that critics are our best friends. For those unfamiliar with my many research trips to India, the teacher in question here is Sharan Singh, 1916 to 1990, who was very wise about how best to respond to criticism. When he was asked why he would say such a thing, he responded that such critics point out those areas where we can improve and thus are our benefactors, even if we may think the opposite. Given this adage and given Joe's propensity for pointing out my mistakes, he was indeed my best friend. Whatever I did in my life, but particularly in sports, Joseph would always try to up my game. Now, sometimes this would get a bit irritating, especially when we would golf together, which during the last 5 years of his life we did almost daily. Let me put this bluntly. I am a horrible golfer with one of the ugliest swings around, particularly because, though I am right-handed, I play left-handed. Joseph, in contrast, is a much better golfer with an easy and beautiful swing. So whenever I shanked one of my shots, more often than not, Joseph would stand behind me telling me to move my hips this way or that way, or to hold the club less tightly, or keep my head down. The variety of golf tips he gave me over the years was nearly endless, and rightly so. Nevertheless, I could only take so much critiquing, and on a few occasions I would tell him, perhaps not so politely, to muzzle it. Joe would hold his tongue for a few holes, but given the inner coach that was part and parcel of who he was, he couldn't hold his tongue for the whole game. Eventually, Joe had to give me his technical advice. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't trying to be obnoxious, he just wanted to correct what he perceived was wrong. In thinking back on my brother's critical attitude, I must say it seems correlated to mostly physical activities, since he rarely commented on my academic or intellectual pursuits. Perhaps this was due to the fact that, though we were extremely close, we had chosen quite different trajectories in life. "4. The Smoker. As everyone knows, my brother Joseph was an avid smoker his whole life. What many may not know is that he actually quit smoking when he was an undergraduate student studying history at the University of California, Irvine. At that time, he was the epitome of health and was planning on transferring to the University of California, San Diego, where our sister Kim was living. However, my father Warren died unexpectedly in December of 1973. So Joseph, being a good and loyal son, decided to move back home to help take care of my mother Louise. He also helped me in getting ready for college. I have been a professor of philosophy for nearly 40 years, and I always tell my students in each of my classes that my brother Joseph was the best guidance counselor anyone could ask for. I don't jest. I remember the very first day I was at Los Angeles Valley College and Joe sat me down and gave me a print sheet with all the classes I needed in order to secure an Associate of Arts, AA, degree in the shortest time possible so that I could transfer to CSUN, a 4-year college. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Don't deviate and don't mess around changing majors. Focus." He also added a classic Joe barb, "If you do F up, I'm going to kick your ass." He wasn't joking. Needless to say, having earned a PhD, 2 MAs, a BA, and an AA, not to mention a lifetime teaching credential in English for college, not even my major, who do you think inspired me to keep on track? My brother. He never got the chance to kick my ass, by the way, since I knew his advice was spot on. Joseph was by any measure a prodigious smoker. When he was finally back in North Hollywood, Joe tried taking up a pipe, like my dad, but that didn't last very long, even though he and Courtney Conti, our longtime friend and favorite of my father, shared his passion temporarily, discussing different tobacco blends and their varied encasements. Although Joe had many people tell him that it would be better to quit smoking, chief among them his own children and his sister, I never said anything to him about his habit, knowing too well that he wouldn't listen to me, and if I said anything it would only cause an unnecessary breach. How fond of smoking was he? Well, let me tell you a classic incident. Joseph had open-heart surgery to repair a leaky valve. He also received a pacemaker as well, and was finally discharged from the hospital after several days. He requested that I alone pick him up and drive him home to Seal Beach. I wasn't quite sure why he insisted on me until he got in the car, looked over at me driving, and said, "Take a left here and stop at the nearest 7-Eleven. I knew instantly why. He wanted a pack of cigarettes, and he knew I wouldn't say a peep to him, since if he wasn't going to take advice from his children or his sister, he certainly wasn't going to take it from his younger brother. Joe relished smoking to such a degree that once at a body surfing contest, he forgot to take his cigarette out as he was entering the water for his heat. Our oldest brother, Michael, was also fond of smoking, so much so that he almost lost his life trying to retrieve a pack of cigarettes. It is now a fairly famous story which our family had retold countless times. Here is the story in a nutshell. My brother Michael S. Lane was our family hero, earning the Silver Star for his life-saving courage during the Vietnam War. However, when he came back to the United States, he told us an unusual story about how he took on enemy fire as they were leaving a combat zone to get on a helicopter. He mentioned trying to retrieve a pack of cigarettes when a sniper fire bullet intended to kill him just barely missed hitting his torso. As luck would have it, the bullet instead shot right through his wallet, which had a small photograph of me and my brother Joseph. It also shot right through a picture he had of his younger sister Kim. I found the photograph in an old scrapbook. My brother Michael came home from Vietnam unannounced. Early one morning I heard the front doorbell ring. I was deep in dreamland and I more or less sleepwalked to answer the door. I didn't recognize that it was Mike. He had lost so much weight that I thought it was a stranger wanting to sell us something. I quickly shut the door on him. Mike, realizing that I didn't have a clue that it was him, later opened the door and pulled me out of bed and hugged me. I then completely woke up and couldn't believe my eyes. "You are so skinny, Mike." "So sorry, I didn't know it was you. I thought you were a salesman or something." Mike loved every minute of it. I can still remember his wide-eyed grin and joy for surprising me in such a way. During our high school days, when we had little to no money, after surfing we would all scrape together whatever coins we had to pick up something to eat and drink, parched and hungry as we were after hours in the ocean and the baking sun. Too often, though, that very money had to be given to Joseph first so he could buy a pack of cigarettes. I remember quite a few times where we had to eat day-old sourdough bread and nothing else as Joe looked over at us contentedly smoking his Marlboros. Yet we didn't mind all that much, since it was Joe who was kind enough to take us to and from the beach in his rusty VW Bug. "5. The Denial at Disneyland. As a plethora of photographs and videos can attest, my brother Joseph was a very handsome man. In high school, he was also quite fond of the opposite sex. Of course, when he was a teenager during the late 1960s, it was a different era, since our generation was provided with enormous amounts of freedom. Parents rarely supervised their kids' extracurricular activities. Having a car allowed one to venture forth unencumbered to wherever one desired, provided there was enough gas money. It was also a time before social media, so teenagers tended to gather in larger groups and meet and greet at varying locales. Since I didn't have a car, I relied on my brother Joseph to take me wherever he was going, depending if I could convince him that I needed a ride. This could and did lead to some awkward moments. One incident stands out in my mind. Our sister Kim took Joe and I to Disneyland during the summer as we were vacationing in nearby Newport Beach. Once we arrived at the park, each of us ventured out on our own. I gravitated toward the rides and Joe gravitated toward the girls. He eventually hooked up with one girl he met on the dance floor in Tomorrowland, so they roamed the park together unbeknownst to me. As it was getting late, I tracked Joe down with his newfound companion and explained that our sister Kim was waiting for us and we had to leave. Joe, by then smoking his trademark cigarette, looked at me like a complete stranger. "Hey, Joe, Kim is waiting for us. We have to leave," I implored. Joe, not skipping a beat or a drag off his cigarette, responded, "Hey, kid, who are you? Do you want a cig or something?" "Joe, I'm your brother," I exclaimed. "Huh? Hey, kid, why don't you scram now?" Joe replied, giving me the look that I should step aside, with his eyes darting to the left towards the Alice in Wonderland ride, indicating that I should wait over there and not interfere with his, "I'm trying to be cool here, Dave, and you are blowing it." Well, I did as his eyes indicated and waited for about a half an hour, until he got the girl's phone number and extricated himself from his James Dean persona. Joe later apologized, and we started laughing in the car on the way back to Newport Beach. This happened some 55 years ago, and I have never let my brother forget it. It became a running joke between us over the decades, and one which made him chuckle sheepishly whenever I brought it up. 6. Bob and Dave left stranded at the fun zone. Bob DiCiro was one of Joseph's dearest friends and one of the nicest persons in the world. I loved Bob the moment I met him. Bob DiCiro and Joe were very close, and each year during the summer would camp together at Carpinteria. I was fortunate to spend time with Bob in Kauai 2 years before his untimely death. We would talk on the beach after a surf session about philosophy, religion, and the state of the world. He was a great musician and loved by all who knew him. To see pictures of Bob and to get a glimpse into his personality, see the little illustrated book, Bob, in Honor of Our Friend, Walnut, Mount San Antonio College, 2019. His younger brother Joe and I have become lifelong surf buddies, along with our St. Charles Elementary School crew, Pat Donahue, Rob Gilmore, and John Appablasa. Bob and Joe met at Notre Dame High School and embarked on a number of adventures during their lifelong friendship. I will share a few of them in later chapters, but since we are on the theme of my brother's nocturnal liaisons with the opposite sex, I wanted to share what happened to Bob and I at the Fun Zone on the Balboa Peninsula during one hot summer night. Bob and I were just about to buy a couple of frozen bananas, dipped as they were in a rich chocolate sauce topped with peanuts, when, realizing we were low on funds, asked Joe for some quarters. He told us he didn't have any extra cash as he was going on a date that night. A date? Aren't we all going to hang out with us in the arcades tonight? I queried. Bob, too, chimed in, surprised by Joe's newly opined revelation. Yeah, there's this girl I met in Laguna Beach. She's the younger sister of John Peck. You know, the famed surfer who smoked a cig while riding Honolulu Bay? Bob and I looked at each other perplexed. Okay, but where does that leave us? We have no money, Joe, except 1 quarter. What are Dave and I going to do? Bob questioned, looking slightly bemused by Joe's late-night wanderings. No problem. Bob, watch over Dave and I'll be back in an hour or so, Joe retorted as he left us, stranded at the Fun Zone, driving off, smiling, knowing something we didn't. Now, Bob should be canonized a saint, since instead of lamenting his foregone night with a kid in 8th grade, he instead made certain we ended up having a blast, even though between us we only had 1 miserly quarter. How do you enjoy the Fun Zone with just 25 cents? Well, let me tell you, Bob was a genius and had figured out that there was this one pinball machine. I think it was in the second arcade room. There were 3 distinct ones at that time that had a slight tilt that could work to our advantage, and if we scored enough points, you got an automatic replay. It may sound hagiographical, but Bob and I played on that machine for over 2 hours, getting replay after replay. So many, in fact, that we even attracted a small group of fans who couldn't believe our luck. Bob knew otherwise. Later, we managed to find a couple of dimes in the sand near the ferry and had enough money to share a large Balboa bar, which we scarfed down quickly before it melted. We then had a heady conversation about philosophy, religion, and ideal surf spots. It was one of the best nights I had ever spent, and Bob would later tell me that he too had a great time. Joe didn't come back in an hour, nor 2, nor 3, but near midnight to retrieve us. We weren't mad at all, and told him all about our exploits. Joe, feeling a tinge of guilt, did try to make it up to us by buying French fries and a Coke for us to share. I never did find out how Joe's date went that night, though decades later I did run into John Peck surfing at Swami's in Encinitas, where he was still styling on his longboard and doing occasional cheetah fives. I didn't ask him how his sister was doing. Entry on John Peck from the Encyclopedia of Surfing. Brightly burning surfer from Costa Mesa, California, the first regular footer to ride inside the tube at Pipeline in Hawaii. Peck was born 1944 in Los Angeles, the son of a Navy pilot, and raised on or near military bases in Virginia, Texas, California, and Hawaii. He began surfing at Coronado, California at age 15. Later that same year, his family moved back to Waikiki. He was involved in the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, a Laguna Beach consciousness-raising group that quickly evolved into a hardcore drug ring. He also lived in a tree in front of Sunset Beach on the north shore of Oahu, served 6 months in solitary confinement on Maui on drug convictions, and was institutionalized. He gave up drugs and drinking in 1984, 4 years later began surfing again, and in the mid-90s was reintroduced to the nostalgia-hungry surfing world as a thin, weathered, flexible yoga master who claimed he could levitate. As of 2013, Peck still surfed regularly and traveled often to Baja California, Mexico, paying for his trips by building and selling neoclassic penetrator models. Seven. The Wedge, Balboa Peninsula. My brother Joseph was fearless in big waves. I know this from first-hand experience, as I have seen him body surf the Wedge at 10 foot plus when he was just 15 years old, and that without his trusty Churchill fins. Keep in mind that the wave at the Wedge gets super jacked up when the pilot swell refracts off the long rock jetty and then slams down in very shallow water. Joe, like my friend Pat, perversely enjoys waves of consequence, where if one made a wrong move it was right over the falls, or becoming a human rag doll getting chewed apart by a pit bull. Okay, that last line was hyperbolic, but you get my drift. Joe would often walk alone from 24th Street in Newport Beach to the Wedge, not minding the 3-mile distance if the waves were pumping. Being just 11 or so, I was far too scared to go out and used to watch him from the shore, amazed that he could navigate the collapsing peaks unscathed. Seeing how courageous Joe was later became my inspirational hero whenever the waves got double overhead. Joe was also one of the first to ride a large swell on the newly constructed metal jetty that Newport Beach installed to prevent sand erosion. This was before they built long rock jetties at 32nd, 36th, 40th, 44th, 48th, 52nd and 56th Street. I remember him taking out his twin-fin Pipo board out when it was big and nobody else dared go in. Years later I asked Joe what he was most proud of, and he mentioned going out at the Wedge without fins and riding it when it was 10 foot plus. He was only 14, I think, at the time. 8. Sandy Beach, Oahu, Hawaii. One of Joe's dreams as a kid was to visit Hawaii and surf. After graduating high school at Notre Dame in the spring of 1970, Joe and Bob DiCiro flew to the island of Oahu. They only had a few $100s between them and thus didn't check in to any of the high-end hotels adorning Waikiki Beach, but instead hitchhiked to the East End and camped at Makapu'u Beach Park. They had picked up enough food supplies and other necessities to last them a few weeks, so they pitched their 2 tents and set up for their dream vacation. But as fate would have it, the waves were not as big and as consistent as they hoped. So hearing that there were better waves at Sandy Beach just a few miles up the coast, a couple days later they hitched a ride and proceeded to find a nice incoming south swell. Sandy Beach is a serious body surfing spot, and the swells come in from deep water and then explode, cylinder-like, near the shore. Joe loved the wave, even though it is known to be a literal neck-breaker if one doesn't exit just right. What intrigued and scared me the most about this adventure was when Joe told me that he was out there with only 2 other Hawaiians in the early afternoon as the waves were getting bigger. Just then, a Hawaiian Coast Guard helicopter flew over and announced over the loudspeaker that they should get out of the water immediately, since 2 large tiger sharks were seen swimming in the area. Joe, being only 18 at the time and finally getting good waves, was reluctant to get out, but he decided that he better swim over to the 2 Hawaiian locals to get a better handle on the precarious situation. They didn't seem bothered by the Coast Guard warning and continued to body surf the incoming rights and lefts. Joe felt safer with such company, but was curious about why they didn't all exit. One of the Hawaiians then asked Joe a question. "Do you eat shark, brah?" Joe, perplexed by the query, responded, "No, never have." To which the Hawaiian responded, "Then shark won't eat you." Joe didn't know what to say given this unusual logical syllogism, but liked the Hawaiian's sense of calm, so he rowed for another hour, ignoring the Coast Guard's bellowed warnings. When he told me this unbelievable tale, I couldn't understand why he didn't bolt out of the water. Joe looked at me with a smile. The waves were that good. If the locals weren't scared, why should I be? Though I don't want to admit it. Okay, it is a guy thing. My brother Joseph always had much bigger cojones than me. By the way, lest we forget, the feeding habits of these water predators, tiger sharks, unlike great whites who have no preference for human meat, are known as garbage eaters, and don't mind chewing on Homo sapiens as a delicacy. As the National Geographic fact sheet on tiger sharks explains, they are consummate scavengers with excellent senses of sight and smell and a nearly limitless menu of diet items. They have sharp, highly serrated teeth and powerful jaws that allow them to crack the shells of sea turtles and clams. The stomach contents of captured tiger sharks have included stingrays, sea snakes, seals, birds, squids, and even license plates and old tires. (9) The Voracious Reader. My brother Joseph was an avid lover of books his entire life. I remember watching him when he was sick with rheumatic fever for several months in elementary school, and he devoured one book after another. Joe's great love was history, and he read deeply and extensively on the two great world wars, particularly those texts providing an in-depth analysis of key battles. He was an expert on the Civil War and read innumerable biographies of great men in America's past. Joe also loved all sorts of fiction, but particularly spy novels and thrillers. He loved checking out books at the Los Angeles Public Library, and I cannot remember a time, except near the end of his life, that he didn't have several books on his table. I estimate that Joe read several thousand books in his lifetime. Such was his devotion to all things literary. I often pestered Joe about which book he was currently reading and his opinion on this or that author. Joe could be highly critical of histories that he felt didn't get their facts straight or posited revisionist interpretations that were misleading and inaccurate. We had a long-running debate over who should be Time magazine's Person of the Century. I argued that they got it right by picking Albert Einstein, given his groundbreaking theories on Brownian motion, relativity, and the photoelectric effect. Joseph, however, was adamant that Winston Churchill deserved that honor, since World War II may have had a much different outcome without his leadership during a dire time of need. We never resolved our differences, though it was always informative to listen to Joe about military history, since he was so well versed in the subject. As Walter Isaacson, Einstein's eventual biographer and Time magazine panelist, argues, of the 100 chosen, Albert Einstein was chosen as the person of the century on the grounds that he was the preeminent scientist in a century dominated by science. The editors of Time believed the 20th century will be remembered foremost for its science and technology, and Einstein serves as a symbol of all the scientists, such as Fermi, Heisenberg, Bohr, Richard Feynman, who built upon his work. (10) Joe's salvation. No, Joe didn't find religion at the end. Indeed, he was hypercritical of those preachers and gurus who preyed on innocent believers for their hard-earned cash. But Joe did find salvation 30-plus years ago. Indeed, it was the one thing that he claimed made his long driving commutes to and from Los Angeles a joy, even when the traffic was moving at a snail's pace. Joe discovered audio books. Back in those ancient times, circa 1980s, 1990s, libraries allowed you to borrow books on tape, which, given their high prices, some were $100, were too expensive to buy. Joe was immediately hooked. I, too, became an audiobook addict, and we started discussing which narrators were the best and which ones to avoid. Almost every time Joe drove to work, whether from the valley or from Seal Beach, he had a book on tape. If the audiobook was particularly good, such as Stieg Larsson's Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and had a stellar narrator, the ever-engaging Simon Vance, he sometimes told me that he actually wished for a traffic jam. Indeed, Joe would later tell me that one of the reasons he didn't mind commuting from the beach to Los Angeles was that it gave him time to listen to his ever-growing library of books on tape. I noticed that he never actually read the Harry Potter series, but he devoured all 7 volumes in their audiobook iterations. In fact, Joe listened to each novel multiple times, so enamored was he by Rowling's fantasy and by those most wondrous of narrators, Stephen Fry for the British version and Jim Dale for the American audience. During the last 20 years, Joe and I were practically neighbors since we lived in adjacent towns, Seal Beach and Huntington Harbor. So we tended to see each other almost every day, and without hesitation we discussed the latest audiobook we had on deck. Joe was old school, though, when it came to certain technological innovations. While he moved from cassette tapes to CDs, he never opted for the purely digital versions of books that was offered via Apple or Amazon's Audible. I used to chide him about this since he also preferred DVDs to streaming, giving me the excuse that he liked the bonus offerings on the discs. I personally think it was because Joe liked going to the library and enjoyed seeing what was on offer. Moreover, though he was extremely generous to everyone he knew, he was quite frugal when it came to himself, and he never splurged on unnecessary gadgets unless he was forced to. (11) Extreme croquet. I moved to Seal Beach in August of 1999. By the next year, my brother Joseph rented an apartment on Ocean Avenue just down the street from where Andrea, me, and our newly born son, Sean, was living, even though he still maintained a partial residence in North Hollywood. Whenever he was staying at his place on Ocean Avenue, we would meet up late at night, or whenever Sean and Andrea fell asleep, to play our version of extreme croquet. This was on the lawn across the street from Joe's place and on the bluff above the sand and the ocean north of the Seal Beach Pier. Our style of play was not your old-fashioned and gentlemanly croquet. No, we decided to make the course so difficult that it was nearly impossible to hit your ball through 3 or 4 of the wickets. In some cases we placed the gates down the sloping edge of the sidewalk so that if your mallet didn't position the ball just right, it went down the mini-cliff some 20 feet and landed on the hood of cars in the parking lot. Thankfully that only happened once, and it turned out to be my own car that got thumped. We played for hours almost every night for over a year until my family moved to Huntington Harbor. Even after that, we still continued to play for the next 20 years, off and on. Joe was consistently a better player than me, just as in golf. He had an eagle eye about placing his ball just right. Joe was particularly happy when he could send my ball 50 yards away to completely throw my game off. It was a beautiful setting as we would watch the lights shimmering off the oil platforms and, in the afternoons, check to see if the waves were good enough so we could go surfing. The sunsets at Seal Beach, with Catalina Island in the background and the lights off Long Beach and San Pedro to the north, are often quite spectacular. If we played near dusk, Joe and I would always stop and comment on how beautiful it was to look out at the ocean with its red and pink hues, especially if there were just enough clouds to give it a semi-Edvard Munch composition. The last great game we had was in La Jolla Shores in the summer of 2021, where Joe, Peter, Allison, Kelly, Sean, Andrea, and our nephews, Robert and Andrew, played on the lawn next to the hotel where they were staying. As we were playing, you could see the glistening ocean just yards away. As was typical of Joe and me, we didn't care so much about winning as making sure that neither one of us won. Joe was particularly pleased when he launched one of my balls some 60 yards, so that my next shot was impossibly difficult to hit. The secret between Joe and me, and something that not everyone knew, was that we didn't care so much about winning a particular game as we did about ensuring it was competitive. There is nothing more boring than playing table tennis, for instance, if the opponent is no good or doesn't give as good as he takes. It is the process, not the outcome, that Joe and I thrived on. Of course, let's be clear, he did enjoy seeing me get my butt kicked from time to time, which was more often than I care to admit here. "12. Running through a plate glass door. Joseph, as his friends and family knows, had a history of accidents, sports-related and otherwise, throughout his life. The first traumatic one that I remember was when my mum got a phone call informing her that Joseph was being rushed by an ambulance to the hospital because he suffered numerous deep cuts after running through a plate glass door. How do you run through a plate glass door? Well, as Joe later recounted, he was playing a game of tag over at his friend's house and running hither and thither throughout to avoid getting caught, in the front yard, in the den, to the outdoor patio. However, after Joe ran through the living room, which had an open plate glass door, someone, we never learned who, closed the door. Because the glass had just been cleaned, the living room exit still looked open. It wasn't. Bam! Joe ran right into it and shattered the glass and got cut all over his upper arms and his thighs. Deep, nasty cuts and blood everywhere. After he got to the hospital, the nurses and the doctor started removing shards of glass from his body. Apparently there were so many broken pieces that they had to change the sheets a few times to make sure he didn't get cut again. The remarkable thing about this, besides Joe's stoicism after such a traumatic incident, he never complained and never blamed anyone but himself, was how calmly my mother, Louise, reacted when she first heard the news. Instead of getting emotional or crying, she took it in like it was yesterday's news and told me, I was with her when she got the phone call, that there was nothing to worry about. He just got some cuts. But boy, were they some deep cuts. They left permanent scars on Joe's upper arms and very large ones on his thighs. Strangely enough, Joe was somewhat proud of his wounds and wasn't shy about showing them off to anyone who asked. In many ways, my brother inherited my mother's forbearance when confronted with tragedies. She liked to keep her sentiments deep inside, and though Joe could get emotional at times, he had a habit of restraining his feelings lest they get the better of him. 13. Outer cloud break and a broken rib. Okay, I'll admit it. I loved introducing my brother to new surf spots, new technological gadgets, and new ideas. Sometimes, however, I may have pushed it too far, or maybe it was because I had such great confidence in Joseph's athletic and intellectual abilities. Case in point, Joe and I were body surfing across the bay from where I live, Sunset Beach. It was a very large west swell in the winter, and the waves were in the 8 to 10 foot range. There was nobody out. Joe was in good condition. He was in his early 50s, as was I. We ended up body surfing for 2 straight hours, but the sets kept getting bigger and the tide kept getting lower. I caught one close to shore and came in waiting for Joe to come in. However, he was nowhere to be found. After about 20 minutes, I started to panic as the sets were very consistent and kept getting larger. I ran up and down the beach, squinting my eyes, scanning the horizon to see if he was bobbing around, waiting for a shapely peak, but he was nowhere to be found. About 10 minutes later, I see this guy in a full wetsuit about half a mile to the north, walking towards me. My heart pounded, hoping it was Joe. It was. He had a huge grin on his face. "Geez, Joe, you scared the crap out of me. Where were you?" Joe, nonchalant as usual, said, "What are you worried about? I was waiting for a huge bomb on the outside and got a stellar left all the way to shore. You should have seen it." Joe then said, "Let's go out again." I hesitated for a moment, looked at the decreasing tide and said, "Joe, I got a better idea. Let's drive to 13th Street in Seal Beach. There is a wave there I want to show you. It's called Cloud Break, and it only works on huge west swells on extreme low tides." Joe was game. We found parking at 13th Street, walked over the artificially constructed sand dunes created to keep the water from flooding the low-lying houses, and looked to see if it was worth the go-out. It was. Not only were the waves peeling left off the very end of the jetty, but you could see massive swells nearly a mile out coming through the large oil derrick positioned outside the breakwater. Joe and I knew it was going to be a long paddle out, so we took our bodyboards and ventured to the outside peak. It took us about 20 minutes to get far enough out so as not to be clobbered by a rogue set. The shape was phenomenal, and there were only 2 other surfers out at the time. I caught a few large ones, and as I was paddling back out, I saw a massive wave forming outside. Then I saw Joe sliding down a 12-footer, probably the biggest wave of the day, going left. But the wind had come up and the water texture was bumpy. Then as the wave hollowed out, Joe took a 6-foot elevator drop and landed hard on his board, but somehow managed to hold on riding the wave from way outside of the jetty all the way to the sand. Unbelievable. I noticed, however, that Joseph didn't paddle back out. I eventually rode a smaller set, and as I got to the beach, asked him why he didn't come back out. He touched his chest and said, "It was a great wave, but I think I broke or severely bruised one of my ribs on that wave." "Yeah, that was a gnarly drop, but you managed to hold on," I replied, hoping he was ready for another session. Joe was sore for the next few weeks, but loved that we rode one of the biggest waves that Seal Beach has to offer. The local newspaper published pictures of the waves that day, confirming that it was as big as we thought. 14. Bolsa Chica, nasty shore pound, and a broken back. Joe and I became very fond of surfing at Lifeguard Station 21 at Bolsa Chica. By 2008, we both had similar blue 9-foot single-fin epoxy boards with a soft top wrap. They became our magic tools. Surfing is a relatively safe sport, but accidents do happen, and sometimes they can be consequential and all too painful. If Joe and I had known that the north side of Newport Pier would be smaller and still be rideable, we would have opted to go there. But we avoided going there in the winter because it was usually too crowded, and we hadn't yet appreciated going out in smaller surf. We wanted it bigger, and north of Huntington Pier, from the cliffs to Sunset, is usually much bigger on a north and northwest swell. On this particular fateful day, we got to Bolsa on a high tide, and it was big and had good shape. 6 foot plus. I could tell, however, that Joe was hesitant about going out since the shore pound was formidable, 4-foot crunchies right on the sand. So we drove north toward Jack-in-the-Box on Warner Avenue, thinking, wrongly, that there would be less shore break. Since the swell was a good one and the sun was out, we drove back to Lifeguard Station 21 and decided to make it a go. However, I remember telling Joe to be super careful of the shore break, since the day before I got mini-pounded on a 2-footer as I came in. I was lucky that day. The next day, which was much bigger, Joe was not. Here is how it went down. We were both on the outside, and I caught a couple of good ones with decent shape. Joe waited for a larger set, took off, made the steep drop, and then as the wave bottomed out, he jumped off his board. Unfortunately, his surf leash broke and his board washed all the way to the sand. Joe swam to shore to retrieve his board, but as he got close and could stand up on the shoreline, a large wave broke in front of him. He basically had 2 options: turn his back to the wave and have it engulf him, or face the wave and dive through it, and hopefully come out the other side. Yet what Joe didn't realize was how truly powerful the shore pound was that day. So when he opted to dive through the wave, it picked him up and pushed his entire body over the falls and punched him backwards on the hardened sand directly on his tailbone. Boom! He broke his back in 3 places in one violent explosion. He couldn't get up, and it took several surfers on the beach who noticed what happened to carry him safely up beyond the water's edge. I didn't see what occurred since I was still on the outside trying to see if I could snag a good wave like Joe's. Then I heard shouts and saw a large gathering on the beach, vertically waving their surfboards at me to come in. Something serious had happened to Joe. But as I hurriedly tried to paddle in, I too was caught in a very similar dilemma as Joe's. The shore pound was super dangerous that day, so it took me 5 minutes to wait it out to get safely in. Finally, I got to Joe laying on the beach with surfers trying their best to help him but not move him lest they add to his injuries. Joe was writhing in pain and couldn't get up. The lifeguards called an ambulance and they drove him to Huntington Beach Hospital, which was the closest one near us. That turned out to be our first mistake, as we should have had him transported to Hoag at Newport Beach. Why? The Huntington Beach Hospital was not equipped to operate on such a complicated back injury. After a few hours and seeing Joe's pain getting worse, the doctors then had him moved to Fountain Valley Hospital, where they could do an immediate operation on him. All during this time they had to painstakingly, sorry for the inexcusable pun here, take his 4/3 full body wetsuit off piece by piece. Taking him to Fountain Valley turned out to be our second and bigger mistake, as we were soon to find out. Although the doctor that did the operation on Joe's back, putting a titanium rod in and grafting together torn parts, was quite good, the recovery facilities there were abysmal. So bad, in fact, that Joe ended up getting a life-threatening infection at the hospital and was forced to stay there for over a week with no signs of getting better. They even wanted to do another, more serious operation. Joe smartly would have none of this and point-blank said he was going to walk out, all this after being bedridden in the facilities for days upon days with no sign of improvement. Kim and I were worried that Joe would succumb to his injuries if he left prematurely. Kim was very helpful and served as a sounding board for the doctors and for cleaning up the lines of communication with her brother. Joe, understanding his body and his tolerances better than us, insisted he get the hell out of there. He turned out to be right. We took him back home to Seal Beach, and the next day he checked into Hoag at Newport Beach, and almost immediately he got better. They had an excellent support team and a great crew of doctors. Joe got checked out a couple of days later, and with the help of his children, Allison and Peter, made a much swifter recovery than I thought possible. He was back surfing within a couple of months, though definitely more cautious than before. "15. The Movie Buff. My brother Joseph and my sister Kim are classic movie buffs. They know who did what, when, and how. Joe had an incredible memory when it came to film trivia. I used to randomly call him on the telephone on occasion and would test his knowledge. I would give him but the slightest hint, and within seconds he would tell me the movie. 2 examples stand out. Keep in mind that this was before Google and the web on the internet. Okay, Joe, there's no way you are going to know the title of this movie. Here's the hint. Jeff Chandler in short swim trunks. Joe pauses on the phone for 3 seconds to think, then as if he already knew the answer but wanted to add a bit of suspense. That's easy, a 1955 film with Joan Crawford, some of which was actually filmed in Newport Beach. It's called Female on the Beach. I was wonderstruck, but I shouldn't have been, since Joe had almost perfect recall of hundreds, if not thousands, of movies. Another time I called him trying to catch him off guard. Joe, here's the hint, and it's not much. Kirk Douglas and 1952. Guess it right and I'll buy you a Coke. I hear only silence on the other end of the receiver. Joe, gotcha stumped, eh? No Coke for you, brother. Joe gets back on the call. Apparently he wanted to light up a cigarette first and says nonchalantly, 52. That movie must be Big Trees, probably one of Kirk's worst. Joe was right on the mark as usual. By the way, even Kirk Douglas confesses that if you are going to skip any of his movies, Big Trees is one of them. Joe was very fond of such film directors as John Ford, Howard Hawks, Frank Capra, Alfred Hitchcock, among others. He loved westerns, particularly Rio Bravo, The Searchers, Stagecoach, Angel and the Bad Man, and Red River. We both agreed that Hitchcock's Rear Window with Grace Kelly and James Stewart was his most perfect movie. He enjoyed the fun of North by Northwest and To Catch a Thief, but wasn't as enamored as most critics are with Vertigo. The ending was too dark for enjoyable repeat viewings. He was a great fan of Bob Hope, the Marx Brothers, W.C. Fields, and Buster Keaton. Joe later became a fan of foreign French, Italian, and Japanese films. He was particularly impressed by Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai and Rashomon. Joseph considered Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight films the best trilogy ever made. My brother also championed some movies that I thought were awful, including Independence Day, 1996. We had heated debates over that film's plot and overwrought dialogue. He was initially a great fan of the Star Wars films, but later changed his mind after repeated viewings and noticing glaring holes in the narrative structure. (16) Sharing his inheritance. To say that my brother Joseph was generous is to slight him. He always thought about giving and never taking. Perhaps the best illustration of Joe's character was how he took care of my mother Louise for the last 6 years of her life. He never once complained to me or my sister that we were not doing as much as he was. During the 70s, 80s, and 90s, my brother Joseph and his family lived just a mile or two away from my mother. Because of this, he was the one person she relied upon more than anyone else. Kim had moved from San Diego to New York, and I lived in Berkeley and Del Mar. Even after he moved to Seal Beach, Joe would take care of Louise almost daily, making certain she had everything she needed. Because he did so much work for our mother, Kim and I felt strongly that Joseph should be given something extra in his inheritance. Louise had owned a nice apartment building in the Silver Lake district for decades, and my mum wanted to give it exclusively to Joseph after she died. My mother even signed over the Hidalgo apartment to Joe, but it needed his signature to finalize the deal. My brother refused to sign it since he felt that each of us should be equal partners in it. Now keep in mind that the apartment complex was worth nearly $1 million at that time. Today it is probably worth $2.5 million. Joe had full right to inherit that entire sum. He absolutely refused to do so. Family loyalty came first to Joseph, not money. I always tell this story to my friends and colleagues whenever I hear about family squabbles over inheritances after a loved one dies. Adding more dollars to your bank account means nothing if it involves sacrificing your integrity in the process. Joe loved sharing. He never hoarded anything for himself, save maybe some RC colas in his refrigerator, which he knew I would never touch, since I thought it was blasphemous not to have Coca-Colas fully stocked instead. (17) Maybe. I've tried my utmost to suppress my deepest feelings about Joseph these past few months. Why? Because I know that if I allow them to bubble forth too much, it will overwhelm me with grief. But, try as I might to distract myself from how much I miss Joseph, every hour or so something will remind me of him. Today, for instance, as I was talking to my youngest son, Kelly, I found myself imitating one of my favorite words that Joseph would say right before I asked him for a favor, which was usually food-related. He always prefaced his reply with the same one word, which he slowly pronounced in an elongated and unique way. It usually occurred whenever he told me he was going to dinner at the Smokehouse across from Warner Brothers Studios. Smokehouse? Are you going to bring back some of their amazing garlic bread? Can you buy me a loaf or two? The kids and Andrea love it. Joe knew full well that it was actually me who was craving the world-famous garlic cheese bread, as they advertise front and center on the restaurant's website. Joe, whether in person or on the phone, would pause and then say, as only he could, "Maybe." It was his way of emphatically saying yes, but also teasing and taunting me, since it brought a smile to his face and a peculiar joy to give me something that I wanted and that he could supply. Every time Joe went to the smokehouse, whether I asked for it or not, he would drive all the way over to my house, knock on the door, and deliver 2 loaves of this most amazing bread. The very smell of it reminded me of my brother Joseph and that very word, maybe. I now use it whenever my kids want something super badly and I know that I can give it to them. It is love encased in a wonderful tease. What made the bread all the more special was having my brother Joseph being so happy to share it. Why I surf. Up until I was 15 years old, I only cared about body surfing and bodyboarding. I had never tried stand-up surfing. I loved the ocean, but I wasn't seriously motivated to buy a surfboard. My brother Joseph changed all that. We were in the kitchen, and I was telling him about how much I loved riding waves. Then, to my surprise and hurt feelings, Joe said I wasn't a real surfer until I learned how to ride a surfboard standing up. I objected, saying that body surfing and bodyboarding were fantastic in themselves, and I saw no need to learn how to stand up on a board, given that a wave is a wave. Joe would have none of that. I could tell that he was simply goading me to up my game and add a new tool to my arsenal, since I was obsessed with all things oceanic. Right then and there, since I always took Joe's admonitions seriously, I said, "Okay, I will learn to surf and then I can go back to body surfing. Watch." I was somewhat irritated and also highly motivated. I wanted to show Joe I could do it. Little did I know then how right he was. I took up surfing immediately, and though I sucked at first, I immediately became addicted. I bought a $20 used surfboard at Natural Progression in Santa Monica that was somewhat waterlogged, and me and my friends surfed every day that we could, even driving to the beach before our classes at Notre Dame High School. 3 of us, Jim Miller, John Robotham, and me, also quit the varsity basketball team so that we could go to Zuma Beach after school instead of being stuck practicing in a hot gym. After about a year, I finally got decent enough to ride drain pipes on a solid south swell without being pitched on takeoff. I got the chance to surf up and down the California coast, including several prolonged trips at the Bixby and Hollister Ranch. It was a game changer, and I have one person to thank for it, my brother Joseph. Then when Joe moved to Seal Beach, we used to surf together for hours at the North Jetty near my then home. I told Joe that the water coming out of the San Gabriel River was extremely warm due to the electrical plant a mile downstream. Being ever the skeptic, Joe didn't believe me. I knew that the water was nearing 90 degrees that day in September 1999, so I thought I would punk Joe for being such a critic. I told him instead that the water had gotten super cold from a north wind that hit the night before, causing an upwelling. I advised him to wear a 4/3 full-body wetsuit. I still remember his face as he entered the water. It was super toasty. It is no exaggeration to say that the ocean temperature was hotter than anything he and I had ever experienced. Hawaiian waters were cold in comparison. Joe loved it even though he was sweating in his wetsuit. We ended up surfing that spot for years. Joe felt like it was California's version of Waikiki. Over the past 5 years, soft boards have become the craze for all types of surfers since they are so easy to ride and are not as dangerous as fiberglass ones. Interestingly, my brother Joseph was one of the pioneers in this area as he bought one of the very first Mike Doyle soft boards ever created when he was living on Maui at Pat Dunlap's place. It was this thick green log that after a few waves got heavier as it was more of a sponge than anything else. Joe prides himself that back in the mid-1970s he was the first person to ever break one of those soft boards in half. Apparently he took off on a fairly large closeout, and it snapped right there and then. The surf shop where he bought the board replaced it with no questions asked. This reminds me of a funny incident that happened around 2005 or so, and one which I chided him for the next 15 years. Joe and I began surfing Bolsa Chica regularly whenever it was good. We were both riding these excellent surfboards that we got from Harbour Surf Shop on Main Street in Seal Beach. Joe's board was a gorgeous red 7'6" tri-fin. It was his pride and joy. On this particular day the waves were pushing 8 foot on the sets. The weather was gloomy and the water was hovering around 58 degrees. We caught a few waves and it was starting to turn on, with slight offshore winds and a lowering tide. As we were paddling out, Joe saw a sneaker set approaching and I was much further inside. The moment is frozen in my mind's eye. As Joe was paddling up the wave's face, approaching easily 10 feet, he was confronted with two options as it was starting to pitch. Hold on to his board and punch through to the other side, or go for the easier play and ditch his board and swim through to the other side. Joe took the second option, let go of his board and dove deep. The pristine red board, which had only been ridden a handful of times, went straight up to lip, and then as fate would have it got thrown over the falls and broke into 2 halves. Joe was fine, but his board was irreparable. Joe was so bummed and particularly mad at himself for bailing his board too early. I loved replaying the scene over to Joe years later, always reminding him that if he hadn't prematurely bailed, that gorgeous red board wouldn't have been needlessly scissored in half. Joe kept 1 half of that board for years as a memento. The great thing about Joseph is that he loved being the brunt of a joke, especially when it made him look less macho. The perfect work ethic. Although Joseph graduated from California State University Northridge and even attended graduate school, he was never quite certain about his career. He was an early computer programmer for the airlines, but wasn't passionate about the job. He held a number of odd jobs here and there, including working at a kite store in Maui and serving as a grocery clerk at Valley Stores in North Hollywood. But fate intervened, and it was a long-time family friend who changed Joe's life. On Blix Street, we had a tight crew of comrades, from the Donahues, 5 boys, to the Dixons, 3 boys and 3 girls, to the Smiths, 2 boys, to the Robins, 2 boys and later a daughter. The youngest dad on the block with kids was Clay Robbins Jr. He was quite hands-on and loved spending time with his boys and their friends. He would take us on his boat to Catalina many times, drive us to the desert to shoot tiny game, introduce us to cherry picking, and every 4th of July pack us up to light fireworks in Newport Beach. Well, long story short, one day Clay called up my mum asking if I was around and could work temporarily at the 2nd District Court of Appeal. As fortune would have it, I wasn't around, but my mother jokingly said, "Well, I have another lazy son, not as lazy as Dave, who can work for you." Joe started to work for Clay in the office. It was supposed to be only a temporary summer job, but it was soon obvious to Clay and the other employees that Joe was very good at his tasks. Clay hired him on a full-time basis. It didn't take long for Joe to move up the ranks. And finally, after Clay retired, my brother Joseph took over Clay's coveted position at clerk of the 2nd District Court of Appeal. It was a perfect fit. Joe built on Clay's many personal and organizational skills and made sure that the department was economically conservative, computerized, and highly efficient. Joe was adamant that the 2nd District Court of Appeal would not become a bureaucratic mess. Instead, he hired the finest employees, installed the latest information technology, and kept in close contact with all of the nearly 100 or so workers under his jurisdiction. Joseph also went way beyond the call of duty when it came to his work schedule. I remember countless times calling him on the phone late at night and learning that he was still in his office, sometimes till midnight. He loved his job and never complained about how many hours he put in. Joe would often go into the office on weekends to make sure everything was up to par and working smoothly. During the infamous LA riots, Joe actually stayed in the office all day and all night, making sure everyone was safe and so he could get more work done. Though it is sad to acknowledge this unusual coincidence, Joe and his mentor and friend, Clay Jr., both died at the age of 69, just a few years after their respective retirements. Clay once remarked that hiring Joe was the best decision he ever made at the court. Joe, in turn, loved Clay and learned how to be a good and decent boss from him. My brother's work ethic was such that he was never satisfied unless the job was done right and in the most efficient way possible. I saw this trait in my brother early on whenever he was building model airplanes, fixing the basketball court, or helping my mother gardening. It is little wonder that Joseph was deeply loved and respected by all those who were fortunate to work with him. The basketball coach. When I was in 5th grade at St. Charles Elementary School in North Hollywood, my brother Joseph, who was just a freshman in high school, 15 years old, volunteered to become our basketball coach. Our team comprised kids from both 5th and 6th grade, with such notables as Rob Gilmore, Pat Donahue, John Appablasa, Dave Sitton, Sean O'Brien, Ed Grady, John Casinelli, Rich Lawson, and later the following year, Keith Kenny and others of my grade. Joe was a strict coach and definitely wanted his team to become good enough to win. His style was not lovey-dovey, where everyone gets a trophy at the end, even if one was just sitting on the bench. No, he liked to yell, cajole, argue, and get in your face when necessary. I know because I was often at the receiving end of his temper. My good friend Keith Kenny remembers how tough my brother could be, especially on me. Keith recalls once that Joe made me run around the basketball court repeatedly because I had somehow messed up a play. He made me do this for a prolonged period, and Keith recalls me cursing at him the whole time. Thankfully, I have somehow wiped that incident from my memory bank, but it doesn't surprise me. Joe held a very high standard for me and wanted his younger brother to excel. He went out of his way not to show me any favoritism. But it was all good, since we knew Joe cared about us as individuals and we wanted to win just as badly as he did. We were all sport jocks and loved competition. The highlights of that year were 2 distinctive events, one of which today is so rare that it is remarkable that it ever happened. In the 1960s, the LA Lakers played their NBA games at the now-defunct Sports Arena. It was the era of Jerry West and Elgin Baylor. Well, amazingly, Joe was asked by the coach at our rival school, St. Bridget of Sweden, if our team could play theirs at the Sports Arena during the halftime between the LA Lakers and the Philadelphia 76ers, whose superstar center was the famous Wilt Chamberlain. Naturally, Joe said yes. But there was a fly in the ointment, at least for me and all the other 5th graders. Joe could only take a limited number of players courtside. The others would have to watch from the stands. My brother knew how badly I wanted to go, but being the ever-fair person that he was, he showed no favoritism to me. Instead, he felt it was only honest to choose the 6th graders, since he wrongly imagined that we might be asked back next year to do something similar. I must confess I was quite bummed out when he told me the news, even though I understood his logic. But, ironically, it made me admire my brother all the more. I respected his integrity in this regard. But putting my disappointment aside, it was a fantastic evening. Our team, led by Rob Gilmore, dominated and beat St. Bridget of Sweden by double digits. We also got to watch a classic matchup between the Lakers and the 76ers. I remember seeing John Appablasa standing near Wilt Chamberlain, and we were wonderstruck about how tall he was. Joe was so happy that night and so proud of his team. St. Bridget of Sweden's coach never invited us back again, and for good reason. The next highlight of that year is one that is seared in our memory, most likely because of the classic team photograph which was taken after we won that night in the consolation bracket. We fought hard and were tenacious on defence against a team with excellent players. If you look at the photograph that precedes this piece in the printed version of this book, you will see a group of very tired but happy kids, with my brother Joseph looking much older than his age. It was a very special moment for all of us. I was told later that my father, Warren, who was stingy in ever praising his children, was particularly proud of Joseph's ability to coach and his maturity for still being so young. (21) What is most important? The most important people in Joseph's life were his two children, Peter and Alison, and his wife Kathy. He would do anything for them, and did. Joseph made absolutely certain that they would be taken care of after his death. Instead of opting to purchase his own house near the beach, he decided to rent so that he would have enough available monies so that he could pay the down payment for Peter's and Alison's two homes. As I've mentioned previously, Joseph was extremely frugal when it came to his own needs and wants, but beyond generous when it came to others. I still remember the infectious joy in Joe's voice when he called to tell me that his wife, Kathy, had given birth to their son, Peter, and later to their daughter, Alison. He was giddy. He was also super protective, and perhaps too much so when the kids were very young. He wanted to make sure that no unnecessary accidents happened by naive outsiders who didn't take the right precautions around infants. Eventually, Joseph loosened up a bit and realized that he had to give his kids more freedom to find their way and also make their own mistakes and learn from them. In this regard, Joseph and his wife, Kathy, were extremely fortunate, since both Peter and Alison turned out to be very intelligent, kind, and hard-working. Joseph was an exemplary parent, but he did on occasion have a temper. But this usually only arose when he was frustrated by things not being done right. I know that it bothered him in later years to reflect on those moments when he should have displayed more patience. It was the one thing he regretted most in his life. He never wanted to hurt the feelings of others, especially those who he loved dearly. But as all good parents know, it isn't an easy job being a father or a mother. You worry all the time about the welfare of your kids. You worry about what they will become. You worry that they should be doing more, or sometimes doing less. But worry is the constant. This can lead to all sorts of issues, not the least of which is a nagging feeling that you made too many mistakes along the way and that you cannot remedy them in time. Yet this is natural if you truly care about your children and how they should be raised and what they should learn as they navigate through life. I hesitate to tell the following story because it is so personal. But I do so because it reveals in brief my brother's personality and how hard he was on himself whenever he felt he didn't parent with enough patience. I won't go into too many personal details here. Suffice it to say it was not a good time for the Lane brothers as we were both going through deep depression at the time. Joe and I were staying at my mum's house temporarily at the time. We were both in our 40s. That should tell you something was wrong right there. We were sitting in my dad's library, lined as it was with his 1,000+ books, and Joe went to reprimand his son, Peter, about something. I overheard it and realized that Joe got a bit too heated in his conversation. He then left Peter alone and came back to the library. Joe was deeply upset, not at Peter, but at his own over-the-top handling of the situation. He was full of remorse. Being my typical placating self, a trait that Joe disdained immensely, I tried to make Joe feel better by telling him it was all right and that it was okay to be harsh on occasion. But Joe didn't buy my soothe-it-over act and took out his frustration and bubbling forth anger on me, calling me out and saying, "Stop with the bullshit. I effed up." Since I too was under personal distress at the time, I got pissed at Joe's reaction to me, and we started yelling at each other until finally, in a classic brother-to-brother moment, we began wrestling and punching at each other. We finally ended up on the ground, with my brother Joseph pinning me to the ground. He then revealed something that I will never forget, and which, ironically, makes me laugh every time I think about it. "Stop placating me all the time, Dave," Joe yelled. "No, I'm just trying to make you feel better," I lamely explained, knowing too well that he had hit on one of my personality flaws, such as the fate of those who are the youngest in the family. "Why do you say I'm a great body surfer when you know you are better than me?" Joe blurted out just as he was giving me some slight punches to the chest, expressing a deep-seated observation that took me by surprise. "No, I really mean it. You are an excellent body surfer." "Bullshit, Dave. You won all those contests." Now we were going into some deep psychological wounds here, but Joe's real point wasn't lost on me. It wasn't about surfing, body surfing, or sports. It was about how a younger brother always tries to please his older brother, and how that can get very irritating over time. I knew he was right in a way, but such was, and is, my personality. Hard to change when you were in middle age. So guess what happened next? Joe and I hugged and started crying, telling each other how much we loved each other and how important our relationship was. Just prior to this, Peter walked in to see his dad and his uncle going at each other. It was an archetypical family moment. It is also one that I will cherish for the rest of my life because it illustrates the deep bond Joe and I had for each other. We competed, we bonded, we joked, and yes, we did on occasion fight, but they always ended up with hugs and tears. I wouldn't change any of it for a second. 22. Don't wear my clothes. Since I'm reminiscing about the physical entanglements Joe and I had over the years, there is one incident when I was in high school that gives a good indication of my brother's fondness for being well-dressed and why his chosen wardrobe was always preferable to my own. I think I was a freshman or a sophomore at Notre Dame High School. I'm not sure if I was going on a date or I was going to a sock hop after the basketball game, but what I do know is that I bypassed my own selection of clothes and went directly over to Joe's closet. He was a meticulous dresser and always had a keen eye for what looked good on him. I lacked such aesthetics, but knew that Joe had a better array of shirts than myself. So naturally, I purloined one of his button-downs for the night, realizing that it fit pretty well. I had a great time and even garnered some long-needed compliments on my outfit. I came home later that night only to find my brother eyeing me down with his Darth Vader death stare. "That's my shirt, Dave," Joe, looking straight at my chest, exclaimed. "Yeah, that it is. Looks good on me, huh?" I responded, knowing too well that I was in a tight bind. "How many times do I have to tell you not to touch my clothes? Wear your own crap. You stink up my stuff," Joe replied, seeming to get more irritated with me as I grinned like a mischievous cat. "But Joe," I protested, "I look better in your clothes than you do anyways." I knew it wasn't true, but I was in one of those moods where I wanted to finally challenge my brother. I was finally as tall as he was and ready for some brotherly rumble. I still vividly remember that we were near or in his closet at the time as I was taking off his shirt. I don't think I treated his clothes very well, and this set Joe off, and we started hitting each other. Not too rough, mind you, but some decent blows were thrown. I had gotten stronger to Joe's chagrin, so I wasn't backing down as I had in the past. But Joe being Joe got the better of me until I started crying and yelled, "Hey, how do you feel beating your brother up over a shirt?" This remark of mine caught Joe off guard. I knew that my punches were ineffective, so I went for an emotional jab, fully aware of my brother's true Achilles heel. Joe immediately got teary and hugged me, profusely apologizing for being so rough on me. I hugged him back, expressing my sorrow for upsetting him, but feeling relief that it ended better than expected. Now, this may make my brother seem like a prima donna, but he wasn't. It's just that when you have a younger brother always hanging around and taking up your time and your stuff unasked, it gets tiresome. Joe had a long fuse, but I had been lighting it off and on for days before this. Of course, this very fight became my way to needle Joe later on when we got older. I would invariably talk about how well he dressed, and he, in turn, would make fun of my very questionable surf attire, especially when I became overly fond of pink polo shirts in the early 1980s. Joe was an impeccable dresser for most of his life. However, when he finally retired, I noticed that he started slacking on his wardrobe and began to mimic me in choosing only those clothes that were uber comfortable: cotton t-shirts, loose-fitting shorts, Vans, tennis shoes, etc. He didn't go too far down the rabbit hole with me, since he did retain his fondness for cashmere sweaters and higher-price foot attire. 23, 56th Street, Newport. One of the best surf experiences Joe and I ever had happened when I was just 15 years old in the summer of 1971. I had developed a sweet relationship with my first serious girlfriend, Cindy Rokow, who I met at a party held by my classmate Steve Smith. We had been dating for 3 or 4 weeks at the time, and she went to Newport Beach for a week at a house that her friend's parents had rented on the ocean around 10th Street. I was feeling lonely, and Cindy had asked if I could somehow get to Newport and hang out with her and her friends. I was too young to drive, but somehow managed to hitch a ride with some older Notre Dame classmates who kindly dropped me off at Balboa Pier. I had little to no money, $2 maybe, no clothes except a pair of swim trunks and a towel, one Churchill fin, and no place to stay. But when young, caution goes by the wayside. After 3 days of being basically homeless, staying in the back of a VW Bug, inside the hull of a 26-foot sailboat, and on the front porch of a house of someone I didn't know, a major swell that I had been waiting for finally hit Newport Beach. It was the best-shaped waves I had ever seen in my life up to that point, and even to this day it stands out as unique. There were perfect A-frames at 17th Street and 54th Street. The lifeguards were calling it 13-foot plus, an odd number but seemed just about right. I didn't have my trusty speedy board, so I ended up body surfing by myself at 56th Street, which was the best I had ever seen it. Indeed, it was so peaky that you could take off on a 10-foot face and not need to pull out, as you could exit right off the shoulder. I was excited beyond belief. So, who do you call in such a moment? My brother Joseph, of course. Not only did I want him to ride the waves with me and bring my speedy board with him, but I needed a ride back home, as my parents were starting to wonder if I was genuinely staying in Studio City for the week with my friend Kevin, real name redacted to protect his reputation. I had no money by this time, so I went to a telephone booth and called Joe collect. Thankfully, he, and not my mum, answered the call. He could tell immediately from my excited voice that the waves were epic. He was also a bit worried about me, knowing as he did that I had hitchhiked to Newport under false pretenses. Joe, being Joe, got in the car and drove down to see me along with his friend Cloby. He also brought an extra pair of fins for me, as I had mine stolen the night before from the fun zone in Balboa, since I carried them with me wherever I went and stupidly left them on a bench for a few moments unattended. I have written this extended preface here because the surf Joe and I got that day was so memorable that we talked about it for decades. My brother Joseph was in top form, It was quite dangerous at 54th Street with a sweeping south to north riptide that took you right into the prolonged rock jetty if you were not careful. Joe wasn't intimidated in the least and decided to swim out by himself as Clobie and I watched on the beach. The swell was too big for me to take a risk at that spot. I was waiting for the lifeguards to put up the black ball at 56th Street to lessen the crowd. Joe got to the outside peak and with only one Churchill fin on his right foot, probably the most epicene fin on the market, proceeded to take off left on the biggest set of the morning. It was a flawless left, and he rode it all the way to the inside. The problem was that he was but 5 yards away from the jetty and with a massive set looming on the outside. Again, Joe being Joe, he took it all in stride and swam straight out to see if he could catch it. He did, but wisely went right to avoid getting smashed. It was an even better ride than his first one. Clobie and I stared in amazement as Joe kept picking off the best waves by himself with nobody else willing to take the risk. After an hour of this heroic effort, he finally came in. Without skipping a beat, picked up a smoke and said to Colby and me, "It was smaller than I expected." I knew that he was bullshitting us, but it was funny all the same. After a couple of smokes, Joe convinced me to go out with him to 56th Street, despite the crowd, and go speedy boarding with him. It was one of the most magical sessions of our lives. We stayed in the water for 4 straight hours and caught the best waves I have ever ridden at 56th Street, where almost every wave we rode didn't close out. Around 3 or so that afternoon, I had to bade farewell to Cindy and we went to a now long-forgotten coffee shop on Pacific Coast Highway, where Joe treated us to an all-you-can-eat lunch. I was famished and ate more food in an hour than I had in the 3 days prior. 56th Street in Newport Beach holds a deep and sacred memory to me because of all the times Joe and I would go there and surf. I know that my childhood friends, Pat Donahue, Don DeChiro, Rob Gilmore, and John Appablasa, feel the same. It represented the best of summertime, and it was my brother Joseph who first introduced me to its wonderful waves. I can never forget how courageous he was on that mega day. It inspires me still. 24. Point Panic, Oahu, Hawaii. The cliché amongst surfers is that it is not a sport but a lifestyle. It is true, even if it sounds lame. A surfer has to be very aware of a number of factors, not the least of which are variable winds, swell direction, and time. You might get big waves, but if it is too windy from the south, forget it. You might have no wind, but if it is sucked in with fog, you cannot see the sets coming. You might have a clear day and little wind, but if there are no waves, it is of no use. But there occasionally come those rare moments when the stars align and you get all the conditions in sync. It is then that you have to be in the right place at the right time. This happened in the summer of 1998 when I invited my brother Joseph and my longtime surf companions Pat Donahue and Rob Gilmore to visit and body surf a spot I first rode in the summer of 1993 when I was on the NEH travel grant to the University of Hawaii. It has a name that right out of the gate intimidates you: Point Panic. At first, I didn't understand why this spot, just up from Kewalo Basin, had such an infamous distinction, but I soon found out when I saw it break. The wave forms off a somewhat flat reef and peels right before expending its energy in the deep water in the channel, where all sorts of boats make their way to and fro from the harbor. Where Panics, as the locals like to call the place, gets its reputation is that it breaks right in front of a long rock jetty, so that if you don't exit the wave correctly, you have a very good chance of becoming one with the rocks. Or even worse, if you're in the wrong position when the tourist barges make their way out to sea, you can have a quick death from the propeller shaft. This tragically actually happened when one of the boats got flummoxed by an incoming wave and backed into the lineup, where one unfortunate body surfer got killed. So the word Panic is a warning call to anyone who rides waves there to be forewarned in advance to be on guard. Panic's only seriously gets good on a decent south or southwest swell, and then usually only in the months from April to October. It is a fickle spot since it lacks the consistency of other spots like Sandy Beach and Makapu'u. Joe and his kids, Pat and Rob, flew over to Honolulu, where I met them at the airport in the afternoon. We immediately proceeded to Point Panic to see if there were waves. Neptune had a special gift for us. The south swell had just arrived and there was practically nobody out. We immediately got in our trunks, put our duck feet fins on, no more limp Churchills, and eased our way down the slippery steps into the Kewalo Channel, where one wrong step and you do a head plant onto the rocks. It was an epic season and the very first time Pat and Rob had ever ridden the wave. They were stoked. Adding to our good luck, we were informed by the locals that the next 2 days they were holding 2 distinct surf contests. The annual Point Panic Body Surfing Contest and the Red Wings Memorial World Championships of Handboarding. Given that our crew was highly skilled, we were invited to enter both contests, which we gladly did, knowing that we would have the extra rare opportunity of riding pristine 5 to 8 foot waves with just 3 or 4 other contestants during a heat. The next 2 days the waves got bigger and we all had a blast. Now you would think that Pat and I making the finals in our respective heats would be the strongest memory I would have from the events, but that would be wrong. What stands out in my mind till this day, and one which I ribbed Joe about for years after, was how much one particular Hawaiian local admired my brother. He was a long-time body surfer and considered one of the alpha dogs among the Kahanalu Body Surfing Club. Well, as every surfer knows too well, the one thing you should never do in Hawaii is cut someone off on a wave. It is the ultimate taboo, especially in waves of consequence like Pipeline on the North Shore, shipwrecks in Kauai, or panics on the South Shore. If you do happen to snake a local Hawaiian, you better be prepared for a seriously verbal reckoning, or worse, getting your clock cleaned after you exit the water. I have personally seen it happen, and it is not a pleasant thing to watch. Joe, of course, knows all about this etiquette, but when the waves are pumping, your adrenaline sometimes gets the better of you. Panic's is, at least in my estimation, the best body surfing wave in the world, and just looking at a set coming in makes you literally lust for it. So, the alpha dog sees a set on the horizon and positions himself perfectly for the takeoff. He sees Joe over on the shoulder, who is also in a good spot to catch it. The alpha dog kindly shouts out to the crowd that it is his wave. He even yells over to my brother, "Hey, Joe, I'm going right. My wave, bro." Joe, who was too focused on the wave to see Alpha Dog ready to take off and didn't hear the shout-out. So he starts swimming for the wave. As Alpha Dog begins his descent, he notices that Joe is also taking off. But instead of getting pissed or calling Joe off, he whistles and in his kindest voice says, "No problem, Joe. Your wave. You go, brah. Have fun." I am wonderstruck watching this go down. Alpha Dog is so fond of Joe that he doesn't care that he had to give up his priority and hand my brother one of the best waves of the day. This, I should emphasize, is not typical. But Joe had that aura around him at times, and the Hawaiians just bonded with him, particularly Alpha Dog. For years after, whenever Joe and I were surfing, I would bring up this story and needle him about it. I tried to do my very best imitation of Hawaiian pidgin in order to get my voice just right. I employed it whenever Joe took a wave I wanted, or if he outmaneuvered me for a set. "No problem, Joe. Your wave. You go, brah." My brother, being as sensitive as he was to the feelings of others, invariably felt bad that he had snaked his Hawaiian friend on the wave. But as I repeatedly told him, "No, you have it all wrong. He was sharing his aloha spirit with you because he liked and admired your personality." Postscript. After the first day of the contest, where all the body surfers had gone home since the sun began to set, the legendary surfer Buttons Kaluuo-Kalani paddled out on his 7-foot board with his friend and put on a truly magnificent display of talent. Joe and I went out with him and just one other body surfer. We shared waves for over an hour until it got dark. The waves were 5 to 8 feet and immaculate. Buttons got tube after tube and came out unscathed every time. I even got the chance to make a film of his unequaled surfing style and posted it on YouTube appropriately titled Panic Button. Joe and I both agreed that we have never seen more beautiful surfing in our life. Later, when Buttons was in Huntington Beach, California, I ran into him at a restaurant and reminded him of that special day. He totally remembered it as one of his best days he ever surfed at Panic's. In the print version of this book, on the next page is a rare photograph of Joseph, Peter, myself, and the Point Panic body surfing crew, with Buttons sitting down in the middle with his surfboard giving the camera a Hawaiian shaka. Joe, Peter, and me are in the back row. I'm standing next to one of the world's best body surfers who is carrying a child on his shoulders. The shirt I'm wearing is from the Kahanalu Club, which was personally given to me, literally off his own back, earlier in the day as a gesture of friendship. Later, whenever I wore it in Hawaii, I would be questioned about it, since local surfers didn't believe that a haole could have gotten such without stealing it. By the way, that shirt was the only one I ever wore that generated envy in my brother Joseph. '25. Frisbee Golf. I'm not quite sure of the precise date when Joe and I got hooked on frisbee golf, but it must have been just a few years after my first son, Sean, was born on August 22nd, 2000. We got introduced to the underrated sport at the second oldest course in America, which was located just a few miles away from my home in Huntington Harbor. After surfing in the morning, Joe and I made it a habit to play a full 18 holes at the frisbee golf course. At first, we both sucked at the sport, but eventually, and after many trials and errors, we got better at throwing our discs. In fact, we became scratch players with a 1 or 2 handicap. On a few occasions, we even broke par. I think our record was 5 or 6 under. We had many adventures on the HB course, ranging from losing my car keys near sunset and having to walk the entire course with a flashlight to find where they were for about an hour until Joe spotted them near a hilly slope, to trying not to get high from second-hand marijuana smoke at the 9th hole, where a few frisbee golf aficionados would indulge their habit. Sometimes the pot smoke was so thick that we worried that there was a small fire brewing. We played in all sorts of conditions, from severe wind to rain to blazing heat. Regardless, we loved it. In fact, we got so dedicated to frisbee golf that we became connoisseurs of what disc was just right for a particular hole. Joe carried with him 6 or 7 discs at any one time. I, in contrast, usually carried only one, but it was a high-tech gem. I used to befuddle my brother with my unorthodox way of throwing the disc long distance. Instead of the typical way of throwing one single wind-up, bend your arm back and fling, I instead did a roller, where I threw it perpendicular on the ground and let it roll as far as it could, with the hope that it would go in a straight line and not curve back on me. This worked more often than we expected. It always got Joe's ire, since my unorthodox throw tended to give me a great advantage when it worked. Joe was naturally better at the sport than I was, but not by much, which made our competition all the more fun. Those who know us sometimes are under the mistaken belief that all we care about is winning, when in truth that's not the case. What Joe and I passionately cared about was the spirit of competition. We loved the process, the challenge, not the requisite outcome. Perhaps the one highlight of our many outings was when Joe was on the first hole, which back then had the receptor cage 100 or so yards down a hill on a dirt path. We had gotten many birdies in the past, 2 shots in, but never a hole-in-one. Joe always wanted to throw an ace, just as he had done several times golfing. I can still freeze-frame the moment in my mind's eye. Joe, wearing his signature long-sleeve T-shirt, lined up for the trajectory, aimed it, and thrusted his Valkyrie-designed sphere in the air. Everything seemed to go into slow motion. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Bang! Right into the cage. We were pumped. Several others saw it, and the manager of the course wanted Joe's name so he could write it on the hole-in-one bulletin board. The third hole on the course was next to a small lake in the park, and since we usually played later in the afternoon, Joe and I witnessed hundreds of stunning sunsets. We always took time out to capture the scene and realize how lucky we were to be able to play such a fun sport given our increasing age. It was at these times that Joe and I talked philosophy and the future and about all the wonderful things we had done over the years. He loved being outdoors, and this park held a special place in his heart. 26. The biggest day of surf. Joseph and I are often asked by non-surfers about the biggest wave we had ever ridden. We never respond very quickly since we have to scan the neural Rolodex of our minds for all the spots we have surfed over the decades. Wedge, Drainpipe, Zuma, Newport 56th Street, Cloudbreak, Seal Beach? No, I think I know the answer. The point at Newport Beach in the summer of 1997 during the famed Linda hurricane swell. Although that was 25 years ago, I remember it like yesterday. Joe and I had initially gone out at 56th Street, which was tipping out at 10 foot. But we had heard after getting out of the water that 17th Street, or the Point at Newport, was all time. Joe's kids were with us at the time, so we trucked down to the Point and parked at schoolyards, since the parking was atrocious. The roar of the ocean was deafening, and as we approached the sand, we couldn't believe our eyes. It was massive and tubular and impeccable and super crowded. World-class surfers were in attendance, including Sean Thompson, who had driven down from Santa Barbara because he had heard how good it was. Joe and I looked at each other and just knew we had to go in body surfing. He told Peter, who had gone out with us at 56th Street, to stay on shore since it was quadruple overhead. I think we may have been the only body surfers in the lineup at the time, filled as it was with shortboarders. Let me provide a few numbers to underline how truly large the waves were and how they were generated. 1. Category 5 hurricane. For those not familiar with such a numbering system, this is the highest possible ranking and indicates that the sustained winds must be at least 157 miles per hour. 2. For those in the impact zone of such a hurricane, the Weather Service gives the following warning. Catastrophic damage will occur. A high percentage of framed homes will be destroyed, with total roof failure and wall collapse. Fallen trees and power poles will isolate residential areas. Power outages will last for weeks to possibly months. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks or months. 3. Hurricane Linda was at that time the most powerful hurricane ever recorded for the Eastern Pacific, with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts upward of 240 miles per hour. 4. Luckily, Hurricane Linda swerved away just in time not to slam into Upper Baja and Southern California. But this allowed the waves to march unencumbered by turbulence and arrive just in time for liquid perfection. The estimated wave heights on the day Joe and I swam out were anywhere from 12 to 20 feet, with some rogue sets going much larger. Surprisingly, Joe and I weren't that nervous. I think it was because the waves were so finely shaped and it was super glassy for an afternoon session. The drift from south to north was intense, and it was difficult to stay in one spot long enough not to be carried away toward the Newport Pier pilings. We entered at 10th Street proper, and by the time we got to the outside, we were at 17th Street in the perfect place for a set. Poseidon, Zeus's brother, and his other companion gods were in a good mood that day and showered their bounty on Joe and me. Looking over at each other just yards away, we both decided to take the wave together, with Joe moving more toward the peak and me more to the shoulder, so as to allow him more room. He screamed, "You better go, Dave, it's party time," knowing that I didn't want to cut him off. I moved more to the north, and the wave just kept jacking up until we just had to go, even though it was the largest wave we had seen all day. To say it was massive is to insult its size. I took a quick glance over to Joe to see if he had enough room, and right then turned back and took 2 strokes and slid down the most perfectly shaped wave I had ever ridden in my life at Newport. It was so wide open and smooth and quasi-acicular that Joe and I rode the wave together without prematurely wiping out or going over the falls in a horrific tumble. No, we rode it so long that we were able to pull out together over the shoulder. We couldn't believe it. "Joe, that was frickin' insane. Can you believe it?" My brother, who usually keeps his excitement in check, hollered back at me, "That was the best wave I have ever body surfed in my life. It was huge." I swam over to Joe and we both high-fived each other, looked out to the horizon and said in unison, "Let's go get another." 27. The Guardian Angel. The generosity of my siblings has always been one of their most remarkable traits. Undoubtedly, much of it stems from my parents, but particularly my mother, Louise, who never hoarded money and who always gave to others who were in need. My sister Kim, who has been a highly successful lawyer her entire life, currently centered in both New York and San Diego, may be rightly regarded as the guardian angel of our family. She has consistently taken special care to support all of her nephews and nieces, even to the extent of paying for their college tuition or offering up your home on Mission Bay. I fondly remember when I was in graduate school in Berkeley and teaching at Moreau High School and was living on a tight budget. My sister stealthily placed a $100 bill in my coat pocket, not saying a word to me. I only noticed it later when I got home that evening. Later in the winter of 1981, she kindly sponsored my second trip to North India. Yet the one person that she helped guide the most throughout his life was my brother Joseph. There are many reasons for this, but perhaps chief among them was that even though Joseph was highly skilled and well-educated, he was never quite certain about his career. He was so gifted that he could have been successful in any endeavor he chose. Yet he was not obsessed in any one direction. He worked for a time as a part-time extra on the television show General Hospital, even securing a couple of one-line talking parts. "Here, doctor, is the pizza you ordered," or "This is an emergency, let my gurney through." Thankfully, Mr. Clay Robbins Jr. gave Joe a job, and he found his calling. My sister Kim knew Joe was mega-talented, but that he didn't have a singular direction. Because of this, she went out of her way to help him find his focus. She encouraged him to enroll in a series of transformational seminars that allowed him to become clearer about what made him happy and what goals he was capable of achieving. Before he was married, Kim opened her house in San Diego to have Joe live with her, rent-free. She also made sure that he was included in her circle of friends, each of whom grew very fond of him and appreciated his keen intelligence. Whenever Joseph had an emergency, such as when he broke his back surfing or had heart surgery or was diagnosed with cancer, she would immediately fly out from New York to be with him and offer whatever support she could. Kim was Joe's strongest advocate, and if you ever crossed her brother, you better run, because she wasn't going to tolerate those who disrespected him. Kim and Joseph had a special bond, and they often had long conversations in person and on the telephone about classic movies, famous actors and actresses, and the latest nitty-gritty details about Hollywood film productions, Both were expert film buffs. What is most impressive about my sister Kim is that she was, and still is, willing to drop anything at a moment's notice to help out her brothers and their children. I know from my own life how true this is, especially when I was going through a severe rough patch decades ago. She did the same for Joseph, and even though he resisted ever asking for assistance, Kim intuitively knew what he needed, even if he was unaware of it. A few years ago, she bought Joe a portable Jetson electric bike, despite his silly protestations against it, and he ended up loving it. I know because he would often ask me many an afternoon if we could go Jetson riding around Balboa or go visit the Gilmores in their new home adjacent to the Newport Dunes. As many of Joe's friends can attest, his hearing got progressively worse the past 8 years. Indeed, it got so bad that he had trouble hearing the television set. Whenever I talked to him on the phone or in person, I nearly had to shout for him to understand me. Since Joe was not the ideal medical patient, he tended to procrastinate on receiving the proper care. My sister smartly bought him a pair of Bose Bluetooth audio sunglasses, which employs a patented open-ear technology that makes it easier to listen to audiobooks, music, and receive phone calls. It was a game-changer in many ways for Joe, and later he would confide in me how much he appreciated how Kim took the initiative to get him a pair. Joe, left to his own devices and given his ascetic nature, would never have thought about buying a pair. My sister Kim also made sure that she was with Joseph during the last month of his life and helping out his son and daughter in securing anything Joe needed to feel more comfortable. My brother's eventual death hit my sister Kim very hard, as it did all of us. But she had a unique relationship with Joseph. Since I've been a strict vegetarian for 50 years, I'm not the best dinner companion. Thankfully, Joe has never had such dietary restrictions, so that him and Kim often went out to eat at a variety of restaurants in Seal Beach, Long Beach, and San Diego. This gave them an opportunity to get closer and share whatever was going on in their lives. Kim and Joe had a special bond, and they enjoyed just sitting and watching old movies together, whether it was one of their favorite westerns, Rio Bravo, or a comedy with Bob Hope, Pale Face, or just an old television series, Perry Mason. Joe once took me aside about a year ago after we were playing golf and told me something in confidence which I can now reveal. He said, "You make certain that if anything happens to me that you take care of Kim. She has always taken care of us, and we owe her an incalculable debt of gratitude." My brother Joseph had a pretty good idea that his days were numbered, since I used to ask him about his bucket list. He always responded the same way. "I don't have one, Dave. I have done everything I have ever wanted in this life. I have outlived all the previous lanes, and it is all bonus time now." "28. The Carnivore That Turned Me Vegetarian." In writing this memoir of my brother Joseph, I'm keenly aware that there are so many stories that I won't be able to jot down. Some of my favorites are too risque for public consumption, though they are absurdly funny. I probably should only share them in private, tempted as I might be to break protocol and proper decorum. The following tidbit is not scandalous in the least, but it does speak volumes about how influential Joseph was in my life and my actions. When I was 16 years old, I decided to turn vegetarian. I gave up all meat, fish, and eggs. There were many reasons for this, including my deep attraction to Eastern philosophy and to the principles of ahimsa. Of course, my mother's cooking may have also played a huge role in my plant-based choice. Don't get me wrong, Louise was a good mother, but she was a truly awful cook. And given her Germanic style of parenting, she would force you to eat everything on the plate, even if the roast beef looked like leftovers from a firebombing. Nevertheless, the real turning point in my commitment to a non-meat diet happened on one special night in early 1973. It was late in the evening and I had just come home from surfing and was scrounging around the kitchen looking for something to eat. The cupboards were bare. I opened up the refrigerator door to see if anything besides my mother's dinner leftovers were edible. Then I saw it. There he was, the Colonel, in all his glory, adorning a basket of Kentucky Fried Chicken filled to the brim with those tasty and spicy skins. Right at that moment, in a temporary lapse of moral fortitude, I reasoned to myself that if I only ate the skins off the dead bird, I wasn't really breaking my vegetarian vow. So I proceeded to eat just the outer crunchy and supremely tasty part of the chicken. No sooner had I devoured the Colonel's fleshy offerings than my brother Joseph showed up, jolting me from my beastly enjoyment. He looked at me, then he looked at the mutilated chicken breast with only its skin seared apart. Right then and there, my brother Joseph embodied the Old Testament prophets of old, or more accurately the Jain, Hindu, and Buddhist rishis of ancient times, and said the following words which I have never forgotten and completely changed my life hence. "Good vegetarian you are, Dave, ripping the skin off this hapless, defenseless, and dead chicken. What kind of sick bastard are you?" Joe was smirking as he reprimanded me, but his words were like a bolt of thunder in my heart. I knew what I had done was a mistake and showed a weakness in my overall commitment to being a vegetarian. Right there and then I vowed I would never eat a piece of meat for the rest of my life. I have never, not even once, broken that vow. And who should I thank for such a life-altering pledge? My carnivore-loving brother Joseph. The great thing about Joseph is that he actually admired my vegetarianism, and not once did he ever hassle me about it, even though he himself liked eating meat. Indeed, Joseph would often go out of his way to defend me to my mum and dad, who initially looked askance at my restrictive regimen. I remember once when a mother of a classmate of mine at North Hollywood High School started criticizing my vegetarianism and alternative philosophical outlook to my brother Joseph at Valley Stores, where he was working as a clerk. He let her speak her mind, and when she was done, he told her in so many words to F off. Dave can live the way he wants, and I support him 100%. Later, Joseph's own daughter, Allison, would turn vegetarian when she was in her young teens, and he made sure that she was allowed to do so without the same kind of hassles I got from my parents and some of my friends. Joe was that kind of brother. I felt the same about him as well. This reminds me of an incident that happened in London, England, many moons ago, and which I probably shouldn't share here, but I will nevertheless, because it speaks about how blood is thicker than water. I was in a park in London having a very heated and troublesome conversation with a person who I thought was a friend. It was getting too intense and words were going back and forth. I was keeping calm when all of a sudden this supposed ally of mine said something critical about my brother Joe. What he said was not only wrong, but so wrong as to be ridiculously insulting. Well, that was too much. I lunged at him and we got into a rip-roaring fight. Even though this friend was right on the mark about his criticism of me at the time, something I could take since it was accurate, when he defamed my brother, I simply couldn't allow it without a man-on-man takedown. The good news is that the fight didn't last too long and there were no permanent injuries on either side. But this incident does speak to the deep emotional bond I had with my brother Joseph. You can verbally rip me apart, but if you wrongly disparage my brother, then, well, the reptilian brain becomes operative. I am not proud of my reaction, but it was a purely honest one in the heat of the moment, even though we know that such behavior is unbecoming in a civilized society. I later told Joe about it, and he responded that I shouldn't have reacted that way. Very true. Yet, despite his apt reprimand, I did see a glimmer of pride in his eyes when I admitted that I got the better of the duel. 29. When we were kids. As I am nearing the end of this narrative, I'm reminded of how Joe incorporated me with his childhood friends who were at least 3 to 4 years older than myself. Most brothers either ignore their younger sibling when they are with their schoolmates or end up teasing them mercilessly when there is nothing else better to do. Joseph never did that. Rather, I got to know each of his friends fairly well and even got to participate with them in a variety of activities. This ranged from playing golf with Norm MacLeod or surfing with Denny Lee, or playing basketball with Paul Sunderland and Greg Schmidt. I even got to hang out on many occasions with Mike Minkler, Pat Dunlap, Cloby, Michael Cornelio, Bob DiCiro, and not just when he left us forlorn at the Fun Zone in Balboa, and so many others that I wish I could list them all. Joe also took care of all of my childhood friends and made them feel welcome. He took special care of Jim Miller, John Hall, and particularly Courtney Conti, who he made sure was part of his entourage. If you look back at old pictures of Joe and I when we were 4 and 8, our mum would dress us in identical clothes, the same pants, same jackets, and with the same butch haircuts. We even got the same toys to share at Christmas. We did almost everything together, and there was nothing that Joe didn't share with me, even if it was a new racing car set or train track that he got. We played endless games of army together, hide and seek, sardines, while staying on Balboa Island, fishing off piers, and playing hours upon hours of ping-pong. This latter sport was our absolute favorite when we were in our teens. Joe and I would go in the garage and set up the table, and we competed for hours on end, even ignoring our girlfriends as they had to sit on the washer and dryer as we battled it out. When I was quite young, Joe would entice me to run to the liquor store, usually Ralston's or Howard's, to buy him a Coke and some candy. He did this by saying he was timing me and wanted to see if I could make it in 5 minutes or less. It was a ploy, no doubt, that benefited him, but I loved it all the same, and felt it was cool that he would trust me with his money. I can recall countless days in the summer playing games in the pool or paddling around in our plastic boat, imagining that we were on our own makeshift version of the Jungle Cruise at Disneyland. I can remember too much, my dear reader, and it hurts too much sometimes when I think about Joseph. I've tried my best to live in the moment and not neglect the people that are still with me now, the ones that should never be ignored in favor of a past that cannot be resurrected. The strange thing is that even though my brother is no longer with me physically, I sense his presence all the time. I even talk to him in my mind, despite knowing that it is merely my own imagination. But that is okay. Why? Because those we love never do depart. They become part and parcel of who we are and who we will become. Joe is right with me all the time. He never left. How could he? He will always be my brother. Love doesn't evaporate because our loved ones are no longer physically with us. The essence of who we are is forever intertwined with our memories of all those we have loved. This may at first sound like insipid, New Age claptrap, but if we stop and reflect, we soon realize that our relationship with others is always predicated upon the very thoughts and feelings we have about them. Those don't disappear. They live on in a very real sense in our minds and hearts. Love has its own unique DNA. Goodbyes are only for those who love with their eyes, because for those who love with heart and soul there is no such thing as separation. Rumi. The Stoic Philosopher. Stoicism. The endurance of pain or hardship without the display of feelings and without complaint. It was an ancient Greek school of philosophy founded at Athens by Zeno of Citium. The school taught that virtue, the highest good, is based on knowledge. The wise live in harmony with the divine reason, also identified with fate and providence, that governs nature, and are indifferent to the vicissitudes of fortune and to pleasure and pain. My brother Joseph embodied the ancient Greek philosophy of Stoicism throughout his life. He was never prone to complain about how others treated him or about the many hardships he had to face in his life, especially related to his health. If anything, he was too reticent to seek out assistance or help when he needed it most. He simply never wanted to be a burden to anybody. Joe loved being self-sufficient and was generally indifferent to the vicissitudes of fortune and to pleasure and pain, as defined by the ancient Greek Stoics. My brother was not scared to die in the least. He was, however, afraid to say goodbye to his children and those whom he loved dearly. I know this too well because we talked about this very fear many times. It is our own awareness that is scary, the thoughts we generate in our mind when fully awake. Death, like deep sleep without dreams, is not a problem. Joe realized this truth and thus knew to his core that he didn't want to worry anyone about his impending departure. Let me give you just one glimpse of how selfless my brother could be when he was himself suffering immensely. My son Kelly needed a ride home after school, and Andrea and I had a scheduling conflict where we both couldn't pick him up. I called my brother Joe, asking if he could do it. He said, "Of course, no problem. I would be happy to help out." What I didn't know, and what I only realized later in the evening, was that Joe was having major breathing difficulties, but he didn't say a word about it to me or to anyone else. Joe then picked up Kelly on time, walked him upstairs to our home, and even hung out with him, asking about his love of video games. Several hours later, I called Joe to thank him for helping us out. He then said that he may need a ride to go to the hospital the next day as they want to do some tests and that he shouldn't drive. He didn't tell me how bad he was feeling. I then probed further since I could tell something was not right. Joe then confessed that he couldn't breathe and that he was having great difficulty walking. I told him right then that I would pick him up and take him to the emergency room at Hoag in Newport. Untypically for Joe, he agreed. It was then that he was diagnosed with a trifecta of bad news which I have no stomach to detail here. Suffice it to say that I am stunned that Joe could have picked up Kelly that day given how bad his health was. That's my brother. He always wanted to help when called upon, regardless if he was feeling terrible. It was the last time Joe and Kelly saw each other, and it makes me proud and happy to reflect upon the innate goodness of my brother. Joseph and my oldest sibling, Michael, exemplify what I wish to become. Good people who care about others, even if it involves great sacrifice. Joe and I had many deep philosophical discussions throughout our lives. I got to know his thinking on a variety of controversial subjects, inside and out. He was a great critical thinker and didn't tolerate irrationality or badly employed logic. Joseph had an unerring BS detector and could pierce through a faulty argument in seconds. He prized reason above all else and was willing to change his mind given sufficient evidence. It deeply pained him when he read or saw injustice. He was appalled by the lack of civil discourse in our politics, in our media, and in our online social chatter. Although Joseph and I had our disagreements over a few issues, on the fundamentals we saw eye to eye. He once gave me the greatest advice that he had learned over the years as a boss and as a parent. Take a deep breath, Dave, relax, and don't overreact. Listen, listen, listen. Patience is the key to life. Conclusion. Ingratitude. My brother Joseph was deeply loved by all who knew him, but especially by his siblings, his wife, and his children. During the last 6 weeks of his life, Kim, Kathy, Peter, and Allison took special care of Joseph. He had constant care, despite his reluctance to have anyone fuss over him. Joe was stoic to the very end and didn't display any emotion about his inevitable demise. He bore it with great equanimity and courage. I want to thank Peter, Kim, and Kathy for being so attentive to Joseph's needs and for making sure he was as comfortable as possible. I know that my entire family owes a special acknowledgement to Allison, Joseph's daughter. She was his true protector for months and had to witness what I and others can only imagine. Allison bore the brunt of Joe's care, and she performed her duty with the utmost diligence and love. To say that she was completely devastated, as we all were, by Joseph's death is an understatement. But she was a trooper all the same and knew her father's wants and needs better than anyone. As for myself, I lost the best brother and friend anyone can wish to have. I probably spent more playtime with Joseph than anyone. There was nothing that we didn't do together, save play poker, which he did with a close-knit group of friends on Friday nights in Los Angeles. Joseph was not one to being overly affectionate, but on occasion he would tear up and share how deep his feelings were for his children, wife, sister, brothers, and extended family and friends. He always wished everyone he knew the very best and didn't have a jealous bone in his body for the accomplishments of others. To the contrary, he relished their achievements and was proud to be part of their successes. When Joseph and I weren't seeing each other, we used to talk on the telephone every other day, primarily to tell jokes, share updates about our kids, commiserate about the latest tragic news in the papers, and set up times for our next sporting adventure. The last time I talked with Joseph was when he called me on the telephone. It was classic Joe. Instead of telling me about his worsening health condition or how bad he was feeling, he said, "Dave, I'm so bored. Nothing worse than sitting around in bed. What are you up to?" I laughed because I knew exactly what he meant. His words later reminded me of that famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Richard Feynman, who on his deathbed captured Joseph's own sentiment in a nutshell. "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." At first, such a statement may seem rather odd, given that the final curtain call is but days away. However, knowing Joe and knowing something of Feynman's remarkable life as a scientist, what both of them were saying is that life is meant to be lived fully and robustly. There is no use in hanging on just to add a few more minutes to a life of suffering. No, the quality of one's life is greater than the quantity of it. As Socrates explained millennia ago, ordinary people seem not to realize that those who really apply themselves in the right way to philosophy are directly and of their own accord preparing themselves for dying and death. My brother Joseph was totally prepared for his exit from terra firma. He always told me how lucky he was to have lived such a full life and how proud he was of his family. He had no need for a bucket list, since his had been full to the brim long ago. Joseph knew what Socrates knew, which is that we come into the world unknowing and depart the same way. It is our conceit that we know more than we do that leads us astray. My brother was extraordinarily intelligent and had read more books than anyone I have known, yet he was wise enough to realize that such knowledge was but a drop in an infinite sea of what remains to be understood. In this way, Joe was a genuine scientist in quest of correcting his errors and pursuing more information, and never succumbing to premature or dogmatic thinking. I know Joseph would agree with Socrates when he wrote, "To fear death, my friends, is only to think ourselves wise without being wise. For it is to think that we know what we do not know. For anything that men can tell, death may be the greatest good that can happen to them. but they fear it as if they knew quite well that it was the greatest of evils. And what is this but that shameful ignorance of thinking that we know what we do not know? The moving finger writes, and, having writ, moves on. Nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. Omar Khayyam. Postscript. After I bought a rough-water 36-foot boat, Joe and I would often take trips to Catalina Island. We would usually meet at my dock at my home in Huntington Harbor early in the morning or late at night and launch off to either Avalon or Two Harbors. We had many adventures, but two stand out in my mind that I feel compelled to retell. The first is when I discovered that you could actually surf on the back side of the island, especially at a place spookily named Shark Harbor. I had surfed it a few times by myself, but I wanted my brother to have the unique experience, since relatively few people have ever had the privilege of catching good waves in Catalina. I had regaled my brother with stories of how, given the right west wind swell, there was actually decent surf. He didn't believe me, but was game to try it out. We spent the first night at Avalon, and we planned to get up early the next morning and travel south and then around the tip of the island, past Salta Verde, Ben Weston, and Cottonwood, to the inlet at Shark Harbor, which was adjacent to Little Harbor. It was a gloomy morning with overhead clouds and no sun. I had no idea if there were any waves, but we motored out all the same. I took the rough water, aptly named Phantom, into the middle of the bay at Shark Harbor and informed Joe that he would have to paddle his 8-foot surfboard the rest of the way to the beach break, since I didn't want to take a risk going too close to shore. It was a bit creepy, as there was nobody out and nobody around, not even campers. I could see in the distance that there was some swell, but suspected it was rather small. I was completely wrong. Joe jumped off the back of the boat and started paddling. I then went to check out Little Harbor to see if it was calm enough to anchor. I told Joe I would be back in 20 minutes. However, I worried about him, so I decided to just put the engine in neutral and watch him from the stern with my binoculars. The minute I peered through them, I got a sinking feeling in the middle of my stomach. It was much bigger than I thought. After a stressful 30 minutes, Joe came paddling back out with a huge grin on his face. "Dave, it is much bigger than you told me, and crunchy. I am stunned. Never in a million years would I imagine it could be like that here. You should go out." We then switched positions. Joe took over as captain of the boat, and I paddled out to the middle peak, or at least I hoped there was some sort of peak and not just a closed-out wall. Once I got in far enough, I was in for a rude awakening. It was at least 6 feet and munchy, but oh, what fun! I stayed out for 30 minutes and caught a few of the better-shaped waves, though that is a bit of an exaggeration, as it was more of a drop, 2 turns maybe, and then crunchy-munchy. After I came back in, Joe and I were high-fiving each other since we had lucked out. It was by far the biggest I had ever seen Shark Harbor. As we came in and moored at Avalon toward evening, all Joe could talk about, besides the waves, was getting an ice cream cone that we discovered at this run-down Mexican food place. Joe thought it was the best ice cream he had ever tasted in his life. I agreed with him. Nectar 101. The next story about Catalina that sticks out in my mind was when I later bought another boat. This was a 16-foot motorboat that could go up to 40 miles per hour. I got it because the Phantom took 4 hours to get to Catalina, and I figured this little boat could get Joe and I there in little more than an hour. What I hadn't realized, however, was that the boat was a gas guzzler, and that one should always carry extra fuel just in case the service pumps at Avalon Bay were closed. I am a fair-weather boater and will only venture out to sea if the ocean is relatively still and the winds are mild. I picked what I thought was the ideal day to go to Catalina with Joe. Our plan was to go early in the morning, hang out for the day, and get back in the afternoon. Getting to Avalon was a cinch as the sea was smooth and glassy. I think we got there in 70 minutes. It was an all-around nice day, except when we were leaving we noticed that the Avalon boat service for refueling was closed. I looked at our gas gauge and we still had more than half a tank. We estimated that we only used a bit more than a third of our fuel coming out to Catalina. Joe wasn't worried in the least. "No problem, we can easily make it back. Let's go." And out we went, overly confident that we would reach Huntington Harbor before sunset. We were wrong. The winds had come up much more than was predicted, and the ocean was extremely choppy with all sorts of nasty side waves. We took turns driving the boat back, and both of us got soaked head to toe from the splashing waves cresting over the bow. Joe thought it best that we go as fast as we could, lest we get bogged down and we would be forced to travel in the dark. About 6 miles away from our destination, we noticed that our fuel tanks had drained much quicker than we expected. Joe still thought we could make it. I wasn't so confident. We had just motored past the oil platform just outside the harbor entrance when we conked out. No fuel. "Oh, shit." I'm pretty sure we both said the same 2 words in unison. What to do now, we mused. We didn't have oars, and the waves were battering us from every side. Joe and I were in good shape and could have swam to shore, but then the boat would have been totaled. Can't do that. Joe, being a quick thinker, noticed that there was a small fishing boat on the port side just a few hundred yards away. He whistled at them, but at first there was no response. Finally, we noticed a solo fisherman turning his small vessel towards us. We explained the problem, and he said he had a long rope that we could hitch to the stern of our boat, and he could slowly tow us in. Joe volunteered to tie the necessary knot. His Boy Scout training came in handy here, and we were all set to be towed in. Then, plunk! Joe fell in head first into the cold water, losing his balance doing the final knot. He was drenched, but laughing since he felt like such a fool. I was just glad he was okay. The fisherman turned out to be originally from Vietnam and was an expert boatman. He very kindly took us all the way to my dock. We offered to give him some money for his troubles, but he refused. He was a godsend, and Joe and I counted our blessings. The funny thing about it all was that our trip was made better because of our mistake. It turned a typical day trip into a special memory. Occasionally, the best of times happens when a tragedy is confronted and then miraculously avoided. Joe and I often remarked that we probably would never have gotten a boat or gone to Catalina if it wasn't for Mr. Clay Robbins, Jr. inviting us with his sons, Clay and Scott, to go to Catalina on his large cabin cruiser. That Joe would later work for Clay and become his eventual successor illustrates the twisted and weird and occasionally fortuitous ways serendipity works. The last time Joe and I went to Catalina was in February of 2019, a year before the COVID-19 pandemic. This time we took the Catalina Express ferry from Long Beach, since we just wanted to go golfing for the day. The weather was spectacular, unquestionably the best I had ever seen. Super blue sky with an even deeper blue ocean, with snow-covered mountains you could see on the mainland. We rented electric bikes and toured all of Avalon, played 9 rounds of golf, ate at a fantastic Mexican restaurant, and took naps on the sand at Descanso Beach just north of the famous casino. A simple excursion, no doubt, but one that exemplifies the bond that Joe and I had. 2 brothers playing just as we did when we were kids. Although we got married, had kids, and enjoyed long and successful careers, we never really did grow up to become overly serious adults. We liked to play, and I feel blessed beyond measure to have had such a brother and such a friend to share such memories with. I miss you, Joe. I always will. Thanks for being the best part of my life.